There is a voice you may have heard without knowing whose it was. Unhurried, precise, faintly amused, the voice of someone who has seen through something and is in absolutely no rush to convince you of it. It surfaces in unexpected places. Philosophy lectures from the 1960s, late-night radio broadcasts, recordings made in a houseboat in Sausalito that somehow found their way onto the internet and into the ears of people who were not looking for philosophy at all. The voice belonged to Alan Watts, and what it was doing, what it was always doing, in every talk and every broadcast across 4 decades, was pointing at a single thing. The thing it pointed at was this: the way you experience yourself right now as a subject inside a body, looking out at a world that does not belong to you, is not a discovery about the nature of reality. It is a habit so deep, so pervasive, so thoroughly absorbed before you were old enough to question it, that it feels indistinguishable from truth itself. Watts spent his life arguing, with rigor, with humor, and with a kind of infectious delight, that this habit is both the source of most human suffering and the one thing Western civilization has the deepest possible interest in never examining. He described himself as a genuine fake. It was not false modesty and it was not self-destruction. It was the most honest thing he could say about the central paradox of his existence, that he taught the art of letting go whilst remaining, by his own admission, thoroughly entangled in the ego's demands. That he pointed toward liberation with complete philosophical seriousness whilst living a life that was, in several respects, visibly unliberated. He was an Episcopal priest who voluntarily defrocked himself, a philosopher without a doctorate, a man who drank too much and married too many times and died at 58. None of this undermines what he was pointing at. It may, in fact, be precisely the point. Watts arrived at his central question through a route that was itself philosophically formative. He encountered Buddhism as a teenager at the Buddhist Lodge of London, not as a curiosity, but as an intellectual shock, the realization that an entire civilization had built its wisdom around the questions Western philosophy had either marginalized or declared unanswerable. His Anglican formation ran alongside this, giving him genuine intimacy with the mystical strand of Christian thought, Meister Eckhart, the cloud of unknowing, that the institutional church had largely suppressed. He did not experience these as competing traditions. He experienced them as different languages for the same territory. That recognition became the spine of everything that followed. The institutions he passed through, the priesthood, the American Academy of Asian Studies in San Francisco, the KPFA radio studio, each shaped his thinking and each proved too confining for it. Every departure was a clarification. What emerged? Across hundreds of talks and a dozen books was a philosophical vision that was genuinely systematic without ever feeling like a system, a sustained attempt to answer a single question from every angle it could be approached. That question was not rhetorical and not mystical. It was precise. Who or what are you really? One more thing about the voice, because it matters philosophically and not merely aesthetically. Watts was primarily a speaker. His most important works were not written but performed, shaped by breath and silence, and the particular quality of ease that is itself a demonstration of the thing being described. When he spoke about Wu Wei, the Taoist principle of action without forcing, his voice was already doing it. The medium was not separate from the message. It was the first proof of it. Part 1. The problem of the separate self. There is a particular way of experiencing yourself that feels so natural, so obviously correct, that it rarely occurs to anyone to question it. You are here, inside your body, looking out. The world is out there, beyond the surface of your skin, and you are in here, behind your eyes, perceiving it. Everything within the boundary of your skin belongs to you in an intimate and immediate way. Your thoughts, your feelings, your sensations, your memories. Everything beyond that boundary is other, external, contingent, not fundamentally yours. This is the ordinary Western experience of selfhood, and in his 1966 work, The Book on the Taboo Against Knowing Who You Are, Alan Watts gave it a name precise enough to carry a philosophical argument within it. He called it the skin-encapsulated ego. The name does something important. It does not merely describe a psychological attitude. It identifies the skin itself as the operative boundary, the line that divides the personal from the impersonal, the self from the universe. Inside the skin, intimacy, ownership, identity. Outside the skin, everything else, which is to say, everything that is not you. The world does not feel like home to this kind of self. It feels like an environment, something to be navigated, managed, and, at best, enjoyed, but never something the self is genuinely continuous with. The self stands over against the world, and the world stands over against the self. And this arrangement feels not like a philosophical position, but simply like the truth of the matter. What makes Watts's starting point philosophically radical is the observation that this experience was never taught to us directly. Nobody sat us down and explained that we were isolated centers of consciousness marooned inside biological containers. We absorb this understanding the way we absorb a native language, through immersion, through the accumulated weight of how everyone around us spoke and behaved and organized their lives. It arrived as the obvious, as the unquestioned background against which everything else took place. And precisely because it was never taught, it was never examined. It simply became what reality felt like. But Watts presses on a detail that, once noticed, will not go away. If this experience of separateness is so natural and inevitable, why does it produce such relentless anxiety? Why does the self that is supposedly sovereign within its own skin feel so perpetually threatened, so chronically insecure, so unable to rest in its own existence? This question is not rhetorical. It is diagnostic. It points towards something structural, something built into the very architecture of the ego, rather than merely contingent on unfortunate circumstances. The listener who recognizes the accuracy of the description, who feels the resonance of being an inside looking out at an outside, is already positioned to feel the force of what follows. Because the anxiety is not a side effect of the ego. It is a direct consequence of its fundamental shape. An ego that experiences itself as genuinely separate from the universe is an ego that knows, at some level, that it is mortal. It knows it is dependent on forces it did not choose and cannot fully control. It knows that the conditions of its own existence, the air it breathes, the food it requires, the social fabric that sustains it, lie outside the boundary that defines it. This produces a characteristic posture. The ego strives. It accumulates. It controls. It secures. It plans. It works perpetually to stabilize and extend itself against a world that remains stubbornly indifferent to its projects. And Watts makes the crucial observation in the book. This striving is not a solution to the anxiety. It is an expression of it. The ego cannot resolve its own problem by becoming a more effective ego, because the problem is not a failure of strategy. The separateness and the anxiety are the same thing. They are not two conditions that happen to co-occur. They are a single structural fact, and no amount of accumulation or control touches the structure itself. This is the full weight of the diagnosis. Watts is not describing a personality type or a cultural tendency that might be corrected with better habits or a more positive outlook. He is identifying what he takes to be a fundamental error in how Western civilization has understood the nature of the self, an error so deep that it shapes not only individual psychology, but the entire orientation of a culture toward the world. There is a specific image of God that shaped the Western mind more deeply than any doctrine or creed. Not God as the ground of being, not God as the animating intelligence within nature, but God as the cosmic sovereign, a being utterly separate from the world, who created it from outside and governs it from above. Watts traces this image with philosophical precision in Behold the Spirit and the Two Hands of God, arguing that it is not simply a theological opinion, but the foundation of an entire way of experiencing selfhood. When reality is structured as a relationship between an absolute creator and a dependent creation, between sacred and profane, spirit and matter, that structure does not stay confined to theology. It permeates the felt sense of what it means to be a person. The human being, within this framework, inherits the division. You are a soul who happens to inhabit a body, a spiritual entity temporarily resident in a material world. You are in the world, but not of it. Your true allegiance lies elsewhere, with a God who is radically other than the world you find yourself in. Watts is careful to note that this is not a critique of Christianity as a whole, nor of the richness of its mystical traditions. It is a critique of a particular theological image, what he calls the cosmic boss, and of the psychological consequences that follow from it. When the divine is conceived as an external sovereign, the self is necessarily conceived as a subject under authority, isolated from nature, responsible to a power that stands entirely outside of it. The structure of the self mirrors the structure of theology, divided, hierarchical, and fundamentally alone. What makes this analysis so philosophically significant is what happened when the Enlightenment began to dismantle that theological framework. The rational critique of God, developed across the 17th and 18th centuries, might have dissolved the division between self and world, along with the God who had ordained it. It did not. The division was preserved. It was simply relocated. Descartes' cogito performs exactly the same structural operation as the theological framework, but without requiring God to do it. When Descartes declared that the one thing he could not doubt was his own act of thinking, he placed the entire weight of selfhood in the mind and made everything else, including the body, including nature, including other people, into objects available for analysis and control. The body became a machine. The world became a system of extended matter, measurable and manipulable, and the self became a pure subject, defined entirely by its separation from everything that was not itself. Watts traces this move in the book and across his lecture series with a clarity that is genuinely illuminating. The theological division between soul and world becomes, in Descartes, the philosophical division between subject and object. The self is no longer defined by its relationship to God. It is defined by its relationship to thought. But the structure of isolation is perfectly preserved. The justification has changed, while the experience remains the same. A self that stands apart from the world it inhabits, observing it from the inside of a skull, managing it from behind a wall of consciousness. These two traditions, the theological and the Cartesian, do not simply coexist. They compound each other, and the result is something more powerful than either produces alone. The theological tradition tells you that you are a soul uniquely responsible for your own salvation, answerable to a sovereign God for every choice and every failure. The Cartesian tradition tells you that you are a mind uniquely responsible for managing your own existence, answerable to reason for every decision and every outcome. Together, they produce what Watts calls the chronic sense of unease that characterizes modern Western consciousness, an experience of isolated, anxious sovereignty. You are responsible for everything and connected to nothing. You are both the author of your life and fundamentally alone in it. The compounding effect is what makes this a cultural condition rather than a personal failing. Each tradition amplifies the other's tendency toward isolation, and the result becomes so pervasive that it stops feeling like a historically produced construction and starts feeling like simple reality. There is a particular quality to the anxiety of modern life that resists ordinary explanation. It is not the anxiety of a specific threat, not the fear of a particular loss, not the dread of a named thing. It is something more pervasive than that, a low and constant hum beneath the surface of ordinary experience that persists even when everything is, by any reasonable measure, fine. Alan Watts gave this condition a precise name and a precise cause. He called it the chronic background anxiety of the skin-encapsulated ego, and he argued in The Wisdom of Insecurity that it is not an accident of circumstance but a structural feature of the ego itself. The logic is exact. The ego, as Watts understands it, is a self-concept that has come to believe it is separate from the rest of existence, and that belief carries with it certain inescapable recognitions. The isolated self knows it is mortal. It knows it is dependent on conditions it did not choose and cannot fully master. It knows that its grip on life is, at every moment, provisional. These are not neurotic distortions. They are accurate perceptions of the ego's actual situation, given its own premises. And so the anxiety is not irrational. It is the perfectly rational response to being a fragile, separate thing in a universe that is vast, indifferent, and ultimately fatal to all such things. Watts writes that the desire for security and the feeling of insecurity are the same thing. This is not a paradox for its own sake. It is a phenomenological observation anyone can verify directly. The very act of reaching for security confirms and intensifies the felt sense of being insecure. The background hum does not quiet when things go well. It simply changes its pitch. The ego's response to this structural insecurity is entirely predictable, and Watts traces it with considerable precision across his work. The isolated self, feeling itself perpetually at risk, turns to control. It plans, accumulates, dominates, and defends. It attempts to manage the future, to secure the present against erosion, to build walls sufficient to keep uncertainty outside. This is not stupidity. It is the only strategy available to an entity that has genuinely accepted the premise of its own separateness. But the strategy is self-defeating in a way that is not merely unfortunate. It is structurally guaranteed to fail. Watts reaches for the image of a Chinese finger trap, that simple woven cylinder that tightens precisely as one pulls against it. The harder the ego works to establish control, the more vividly it becomes aware of how much lies beyond control. Each successful act of management reveals a larger field of the unmanageable. The medicine intensifies the disease. The war against insecurity is conducted with weapons that are constitutionally incapable of winning it, not because the ego lacks intelligence, but because it is responding to a misdiagnosis. The problem is not that the ego has failed to find sufficient security. The problem is that the ego, as a separate self, is the condition from which the insecurity arises. What happens when this individual psychology is not merely a private predicament, but the foundational assumption of an entire civilization? is something Watts addresses with unflinching directness in the book and throughout his ecological writings. A culture built upon the premise of the separate self will, at civilizational scale, reproduce the ego's characteristic behavior. It will treat the natural world not as a community to which it belongs, but as a resource to be controlled, extracted, and subordinated. The ecological crisis, on this account, is not a separate problem from the crisis of the self. It is the same problem expressed at a different magnitude. The exploitation of nature is the ego's war against insecurity, conducted with industrial instruments. Competitive social structures that arrange isolated selves against one another in zero-sum contests of accumulation and dominance are not aberrations from the Western project. They are its logical expression, and the spiritual emptiness that Watts observed throughout his life in Western culture, the gnawing sense of meaninglessness that prosperity does nothing to resolve, is the direct felt consequence of a self that has severed its sense of participation in anything larger than its own survival. Watts is not offering a program of personal improvement. Alan Watts gave his most important single book a title that was itself a philosophical provocation. The book, On the Taboo, Against Knowing Who You Are, published in 1966, does not describe a mistake or a confusion. It describes a taboo. The distinction matters enormously. A mistake is something that, once pointed out, can be corrected through better information or clearer thinking. A taboo is something different in kind. It is an actively enforced prohibition, a boundary that a community maintains not because crossing it would lead to error, but because crossing it would disturb something the community depends upon. Watts's central claim is that the misidentification of the self with what he calls the skin-encapsulated ego is not an accident that Western civilization has stumbled into through philosophical carelessness. It is a condition that the social order has a profound structural interest in maintaining. This is not a conspiracy theory, and Watts is careful to distinguish his argument from anything so simple. No individual, no institution, no governing body need be consciously aware of this dynamic for it to operate with complete and systematic force. The isolated, anxious ego turns out to be an extraordinarily useful social unit. It is competitive and therefore productive. It is insecure about its status and its adequacy, and therefore susceptible to advertising, to the endless purchase of things that promise to make it feel more real, more significant, more complete. It is obedient to authority, because authority offers the promise of external validation that the ego cannot generate from within itself, and it is perpetually dissatisfied, which makes it a reliable engine of economic activity. A person who genuinely knew who they were, in the sense Watts means, would be far less useful to this apparatus. The taboo against that knowledge is therefore not incidental to the social order. It is, in a very real sense, foundational. The taboo operates simultaneously at multiple levels, and Watts traces its workings through each of them in the book with a precision that rewards close attention. At the cultural level, it is embedded in the very structure of language. In English, and in most Western languages, the word I functions as a noun, a fixed, stable thing, a subject that persists through time and stands apart from its experiences. But this grammatical convention is not a neutral description of reality. It is a conceptual frame that carves experience into a perceiver and a world perceived, a self and its surroundings, a subject enclosed within a skin, and an object spread out beyond it. The language does not merely describe the ego. It continuously recreates it, moment by moment, in every sentence, spoken or thought. At the educational level, the reinforcement becomes more explicit. Children are trained through the entire apparatus of schooling and socialization to identify themselves with their performance, their reputation, and their social role. The question, "Who are you?" receives the answer. You are what others see when they look at you. You are your grades, your behavior, your standing amongst your peers, your eventual career. The awareness that does the seeing, the consciousness that precedes all these roles and performances, is never offered as the locus of identity. The child is systematically turned outward, taught to become the person that others see, rather than the awareness that does the seeing. By the time this training is complete, the identification feels so natural, so obvious, that the possibility of any alternative seems almost incoherent. The religious dimension runs deeper still. The doctrine of the individual soul, as it has operated in mainstream Western Christianity, reinforces the ego's sense of isolated, ultimate responsibility. The soul is a separate entity that must earn its salvation, must stand before judgment as an individual, must carry the weight of its own moral history across eternity. Even the promise of divine love, in this framework, is addressed to a self conceived as fundamentally alone. Watts observed that this theological structure, whatever its spiritual intentions, performs exactly the same function as the cultural and educational systems. It makes the isolated ego feel not merely real but cosmically significant in its isolation. The three levels, cultural, educational, and religious. Part 2. The map and the territory. There is a phrase Alan Watts returned to again and again across his lectures and writings, and it is one of those rare formulations that, once heard, reorganizes the way you perceive your own thinking. The menu is not the meal. Simple enough on the surface. Obvious, even, and yet Watts insisted that the failure to truly understand this distinction was responsible for one of the deepest forms of confusion available to human beings. Human beings are, uniquely amongst animals, creatures who live primarily inside their own symbolic representations of reality. Other animals respond to the world directly. They do not, as far as we can tell, interpose a layer of verbal commentary between experience and response. A cat encountering a bird does not first think the word bird. The response is immediate, total, and unreflected. But for the human animal, something has intervened. We do not simply experience the world. We experience our descriptions of the world. Watts developed this theme at length in The Way of Zen, published in 1957, and returned to it throughout his lecture series on the nature of consciousness. The argument is phenomenological before it is philosophical. Watch what actually happens when you encounter a tree. The sensory data arrives, rich and particular. The specific quality of the light falling through those specific leaves, the texture of bark, the smell of the air around it. And then, almost instantaneously, before conscious awareness has even registered the encounter, the verbal mind translates all of that into a single word, tree. And with that word comes an entire network of associations, categories, prior experiences, and expectations. The direct encounter is filtered through a conceptual grid before it ever reaches the part of you that might be said to be paying attention. The word is a map. The experience was the territory, and the map has already replaced it. Now, the verbal mind's tendency to simplify is not a flaw in human cognition. This is the crucial point that Watts was careful to establish before pressing his critique. Language and conceptual thought are extraordinary achievements. They allow human beings to plan across time, to communicate with precision, to accumulate and transmit knowledge across generations in ways no other species can approach. The capacity to represent reality symbolically is the basis of science, of art, of civilization itself. Tools of this power are not to be dismissed, but tools work by simplifying. That is precisely what makes them useful. The word tree captures something genuinely real about trees. It identifies a class of objects that share relevant properties, and it allows us to think and speak about them efficiently. The map is not worthless. The map is extraordinarily valuable. What the map cannot do, by its very nature, is capture the infinite particularity of this tree, now, in this light, at this moment. The map is always less than the territory. It must be, or it would not be a map. A map the size of the territory, reproducing every feature in exact detail, would be entirely useless. The problem, then, is not that we use maps. The problem arises at the precise moment we forget that we are using them. When the map is mistaken for the territory, something quietly catastrophic occurs. The map stops serving us and begins governing us. Watts drew here on the formulation of Alfred Korzybski, the Polish-American philosopher and founder of general semantics, who had argued that the map is not the territory and that a great deal of human suffering followed from forgetting this. Watts encountered Korzybski's work and carried its insight in a distinctly different direction, less concerned with the technical reform of language and more concerned with the psychological and existential consequences of living inside one's own descriptions. When the word water is confused with the experience of drinking, something essential has been lost. We no longer respond to reality. We respond to our descriptions of reality, and our descriptions, being simplified, being categorical, being organized around the ego's accumulated needs and fears, systematically distort what is actually present. This is not merely an epistemological observation about the limits of language. It is a psychological diagnosis. The person who lives primarily inside their descriptions of experience is cut off from the direct encounter with the world that Watts regarded as the ground of genuine wisdom. Descartes believed that thinking was the ground of existence. Cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore, I am. This was not merely a philosophical argument, but a founding act of Western self-definition, and its consequences have been profound. If thinking is what you are, then selfhood and the interior monologue of language become inseparable. The mind that ceaselessly narrates, analyses, and categorizes is not simply a tool the self employs. It is, in the Cartesian framework, the self itself. Watts saw this as one of the most consequential errors in the Western philosophical tradition, and he returned to it repeatedly across his work, most directly in the book and in his lecture series, The Tao of Philosophy. He called it the tyranny of the verbal mind, the elevation of abstract, discursive, conceptual thinking to the status of the only legitimate form of knowing. This tyranny is not merely a cultural preference for argument over intuition or for analysis over sensation. It is a philosophical position with real existential consequences. If you are your thinking, then the cessation of thought becomes a kind of death. The moment the inner monologue falls silent, something feels as though it is dissolving. This is precisely why genuine meditation is so difficult for many Western practitioners. The instruction to simply sit, to allow thought to quieten without immediately replacing it with more thought, produces not peace, but panic. The verbal mind, accustomed to treating its own activity as the guarantee of existence, Watts observed this with characteristic precision. The anxiety is not incidental to the practice, but structural, built into the very assumption that selfhood requires constant mental commentary to sustain itself. What this produces, in ordinary life, is a condition Watts described as the double take. Experience arrives, and immediately the verbal mind steps in to narrate it, assess it, and file it away. The event and the commentary on the event become so entangled that direct contact with experience itself becomes almost impossible. A meal is consumed whilst attention is elsewhere. A walk through a landscape becomes an occasion for composing mental lists. The body is present, but awareness has retreated into the commentary booth, observing life from a slight but decisive distance. In The Wisdom of Insecurity, Watts wrote that we are living in a culture entirely hypnotized by the illusion of time, and this hypnosis is precisely the double take in operation, always processing the past, always anticipating the future, always somewhere other than where experience is actually occurring. The crucial point is that this is not a personal failing, not a habit that particularly anxious or distracted individuals have acquired through weakness of character. It is culturally induced, so pervasive and so thoroughly normalized that it presents itself as the natural condition of consciousness rather than a learned and remarkably peculiar way of relating to experience. The verbal mind does not only narrate. By its very structure, it divides. Language operates through distinction and categorization. This is not that. Here is not there. Self is not world. Good is not bad. Past is not future. These divisions are genuinely useful for navigating practical reality. The problem arises when they are taken as ultimate descriptions of how things are, rather than as convenient tools for handling experience. Watts drew extensively on the Zen tradition's deep suspicion of conceptual thought to illuminate this point, and he was careful to distinguish that suspicion from anti-intellectualism. Zen does not oppose thinking. It opposes the mistake of confusing the map for the territory, of treating the verbal grid we lay over reality as though it were reality itself. The koan, that deliberately paradoxical question the Zen master poses to a student, is not a puzzle to be solved by cleverer thinking. It is a device for breaking the verbal mind's grip entirely, for forcing an encounter with experience that no concept can adequately mediate. When the student asks what is the sound of one hand clapping, no answer formulated in the usual categories of thought will satisfy. The koan works precisely by exhausting the verbal mind, by driving it to the edge of its own competence and beyond. What the verbal mind's divisions ultimately obscure is the continuity beneath apparent opposites. Western thought has a deep and largely unexamined habit of treating opposites as genuinely separate things. Light and darkness are not merely different conditions. They are, in the Western imagination, adversaries. Good and evil are not two ends of a spectrum, but two independent forces locked in genuine conflict. Self and other are not relational terms, but distinct entities. One inside the skin and one outside it. This way of carving up reality feels so natural, so obviously correct, that it rarely gets examined at all. Watts examined it relentlessly, and what he found was that the categories themselves were wrong. In The Two Hands of God, and throughout his lecture series on the Tao of philosophy, Watts draws on both Taoist and Vedantic sources to make a precise epistemological point. What the verbal mind classifies as opposites are not independent entities in conflict, but poles of a single continuum. They define each other. They require each other. Without the concept of down, the concept of up is literally meaningless. Without the experience of pain, Pleasure has no contrast against which to register. Without silence, sound is not sound, but simply the undifferentiated background of existence. The apparent opposites are not two things but two aspects of one thing, and the verbal mind has been systematically misreading this relational structure as a confrontation between independent forces. This is not a mystical claim. It is, at its core, a point about how language and cognition work. The verbal mind operates by drawing distinctions, and distinctions require two sides. When you draw a line, you simultaneously create both sides of it. The problem arises when the mind forgets that it drew the line and begins to treat the two sides as if they had always been separate, as if the distinction it imposed on reality were a feature of reality itself, rather than a feature of the map it drew. Watts calls this the confusion of the map with the territory, and nowhere is this confusion more consequential than in the treatment of opposites as genuine antagonists rather than as the poles that jointly constitute a single dimension of experience. The genuinely destabilizing implication of this recognition is what Watts pursues with particular care, because it is not a comfortable thought. If opposites are poles of a single continuum, then the verbal mind's entire operating project is built on a misunderstanding of its own categories. The project of the ego, as Watts analyses it, is essentially the project of keeping the positive pole and eliminating the negative pole, pursuing pleasure whilst avoiding pain, accumulating security whilst eliminating risk, cultivating the good self whilst suppressing the bad self. But if the positive and negative poles arise together and define each other, this project is not merely difficult, it is incoherent. Attempting to keep only one side of a polarity is precisely like trying to have a coin with only one face. The more vigorously you pursue the one side, the more forcefully you call the other side into being. Watts states this with characteristic directness in The Wisdom of Insecurity. The desire for security and the feeling of insecurity are the same thing. This is the polarity insight applied to the ego's most fundamental project. The very intensity of the search for safety is itself the experience of being unsafe. The mind that most desperately wants to feel certain is the mind most acutely aware of uncertainty. The pursuit does not resolve the polarity. It sustains it, because the pursuit and the anxiety are not cause and effect, but two names for the same movement of consciousness. The most philosophically significant application of this insight concerns the polarity of self and other. If self and other are poles of a single continuum rather than genuinely separate entities, then the picture of the self as imprisoned inside the skin is not a discovery about the nature of consciousness, but a product of a categorical error. The boundary at the skin is real as a biological fact, but it is not a wall between two independent systems. It is more like the surface of a wave, which appears to be a distinct thing whilst being entirely continuous with the ocean that produces it. Watts is precise about this. You are not a self that has relationships with an external world. You are, in a very real sense, a pattern of relationships. Part 3. The Zen Encounter. Alan Watts published The Way of Zen in 1957, and it remains one of the most philosophically serious introductions to Zen Buddhism ever written for a Western audience. Not a tourist's guide to an exotic tradition, and not a spiritual self-help manual dressed in Eastern clothing. Watts was doing something genuinely difficult, translating a mode of understanding that had developed over centuries in Japan and China into terms that a Western mind could encounter without immediately domesticating it into something familiar and therefore harmless. The achievement matters because the temptation to domesticate Zen is almost irresistible. The Western mind, trained to sort everything into categories, immediately wants to know, is this a religion, a philosophy, a form of therapy? Watts' answer is that Zen is none of these things in the Western sense, and the failure to grasp that distinction is the first and most consequential mistake a Western reader can make. Zen is not a religion because it carries no creed. There is nothing to believe, no doctrinal statement to assent to, no God whose existence must be affirmed. There is no soul in the Christian sense, no immortal essence awaiting salvation or damnation. Zen emerged historically from the encounter between Indian Buddhism, with its sustained analysis of consciousness and its emphasis on liberation from suffering, and Chinese Taoism, with its deep feeling for naturalness, for the way things move when they are not forced. From Buddhism, Zen inherited the conviction that ordinary human consciousness is in some fundamental way obscured, that we do not see things as they are. From Taoism, it inherited the suspicion of all effort that works against the grain of nature, the sense that the deepest wisdom is expressed not in grand gestures but in the quality of attention brought to the most ordinary acts. What Zen is, in Watts' account, is a practice of direct seeing, a set of methods for cutting through the conceptual veil and encountering reality without the mediation of the verbal mind. The phrase direct seeing immediately raises a question, and it is a question Watts was careful to address. Seeing what, exactly? If the verbal mind is the problem, one might naturally assume that Zen offers a solution in the form of a better description of reality, a more accurate map, a corrected account of what the world truly is, freed from the distortions of ordinary thinking. This is precisely the misunderstanding Watts wanted to prevent, because it is a misunderstanding that would turn Zen into just another philosophy, another set of propositions competing with other sets of propositions. The Japanese word Zen derives from the Sanskrit dhyana, meaning absorbed attention, not a new theory, not a revised cosmology, a different quality of attention altogether. The distinction is crucial, and Watts returns to it throughout the way of Zen. Western meditation, as it tends to be understood, involves a kind of inward withdrawal, a turning away from the noise and complexity of ordinary experience toward some quieter, purer, inner state. Zen meditation moves in precisely the opposite direction. It is a turning toward the world, toward immediate experience, with complete and undivided attention. Watts describes the Zen master's daily life in terms that are deliberately unremarkable: chopping wood, carrying water. These are not interruptions to the practice. They are the practice, understood as a quality of presence brought to whatever is actually happening. The deeper philosophical implication of this distinction becomes clear when you examine what the great Zen masters were actually doing as teachers. They were not offering better descriptions of reality. They were not correcting their students' metaphysics. They were attempting, by any means available, to get their students to abandon the map entirely and look directly at the territory. This is why Zen teaching is so deliberately paradoxical, so resistant to being captured in summary. Any summary is already a map. The moment you say, Zen teaches that, you have already stepped back from the thing itself into the realm of propositions about the thing, and the whole enterprise has quietly collapsed. Watts quotes the Zen master Huang Po on precisely this point. The foolish reject what they see, not what they think. The wise reject what they think, not what they see. The inversion is exact and uncompromising. The koan is probably the most famous and most misunderstood instrument in Zen Buddhism. Watts returns to it throughout his work, most systematically in The Way of Zen and across his lecture series Out of Your Mind, and he is insistent on one point from the beginning: the koan is not a riddle, It does not have a hidden answer that the clever student eventually uncovers. The most famous example: what is the sound of one hand clapping? Is not waiting for a witty response. It is a trap, and it is a trap set with extraordinary philosophical precision. The mechanism works like this. The student takes the koan to meditation, turns it over, applies every instrument of conceptual thought available, and fails. They try again. They fail again. The teacher offers no encouragement, no hints, no indication that they are getting warmer. The koan resists every approach that the analytical, verbal mind can devise, because it is specifically designed to resist those approaches. Every attempt to answer it conceptually is an attempt to solve the wrong kind of problem with the wrong kind of tool, and the koan is constructed so that this mismatch becomes impossible to ignore. What Watts identifies as remarkable is that this is not cruelty or obscurantism. It is philosophical precision. The koan targets the exact cognitive habit that, as we explored in the previous module, is the root of the ego's predicament, the assumption that every genuine question must have a conceptual answer. That reality is ultimately graspable by the verbal, dualistic mind. The koan is calibrated to the precise nature of the disease. What happens at the point of collapse is what Zen calls satori. When the verbal mind has exhausted every strategy, when it can no longer maintain its habitual work of analysis and control, something else becomes possible. Watts is careful throughout his writing to demystify this experience, to resist the romantic and supernatural interpretations that Western audiences tend to project onto it. Satori is not a vision of God. It is not a permanent state of bliss. It is not something exotic or otherworldly. In the way of Zen, Watts describes it simply as the experience of seeing clearly, of encountering the world without the filter of the verbal, ego-driven mind. It carries a quality of profound naturalness, as though one has simply stopped performing an unnecessary and exhausting action and returned to a more fundamental mode of being. This is why Watts quotes with such evident pleasure the Zen saying, "Before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water." The world does not change. The activity does not change. What changes is the absence of the overlay, the commentary, the anxious self-monitoring that the ego imposes on every moment of experience. The philosophical implication for the question of selfhood is precise and demanding. Satori is not something the ego achieves. It is the cessation of the ego's habitual activity. This is not a paradox offered for its rhetorical elegance. It is a structural observation about the nature of the attempt. The ego that is trying to attain enlightenment is the ego that enlightenment dissolves. The very posture of striving reinforces the condition that striving is trying to overcome. Every effort the student makes to grasp satori is an assertion of the separate, controlling self, and that assertion is exactly what stands between the student and the clarity they are seeking. Watts puts it directly in the way of Zen. The koan is not a question to be answered, but a situation to be lived. The student is not solving a puzzle. They are being brought, through sustained and unavoidable frustration, to the recognition that the puzzle-solving mind is itself the obstacle. This connects to something Watts calls the backwards law, which will be examined fully in the next submodule, but whose shape is already visible here. The koan makes that law unavoidable. It stages, in the most direct and concentrated form possible, the predicament of a consciousness that is trying to do something that can only happen in the absence of trying. And what becomes clear, as Watts develops the argument, is that this predicament is not peculiar to Zen practice. It is a structural feature of ego-driven consciousness. wherever it attempts to control what lies beyond its control. There is a particular kind of trap that the thinking mind builds for itself, and once you see its structure clearly, you begin to recognize it everywhere. Gregory Bateson, the anthropologist and systems theorist, gave it a name: the double bind. Watts seized on this concept throughout his work, most systematically in psychotherapy East and West, and used it to illuminate something that had been intuited in Zen for centuries, but rarely articulated in Western philosophical terms. A double bind is a situation in which you are commanded to do something that can only be done spontaneously. The moment you attempt to comply deliberately, you have already failed. The command itself destroys the conditions for its own fulfillment. Watts's examples are disarmingly ordinary. Someone tells you to relax. The instruction immediately produces a self-monitoring attention to whether you are relaxing, which is the precise opposite of relaxation. Someone says, "Be natural." The attempt to be natural is itself unnatural, a performance of naturalness that announces its own artificiality. Someone says, "Don't think about it." The instruction places the forbidden thought at the center of awareness. Each of these commands is structurally self-defeating. The effort to comply generates exactly the self-consciousness it was trying to eliminate. The harder you try, the more comprehensively you fail. The spiritual double bind is the most concentrated instance of this general structure. A person wants to become enlightened. They commit to practice, to discipline, to the sustained pursuit of a transformed state of consciousness. But enlightenment, as Zen understands it, is precisely the dissolution of the ego that is doing the pursuing. The seeker is the obstacle. The goal-directed self is the very thing that must be relinquished, and yet it is that self which is doing the relinquishing. The project is incoherent from its first moment, not because enlightenment is impossible, but because the framework within which it is being sought guarantees its own failure. The Zen collection known as the Mumonkan, the gateless gate, gives this paradox its most elegant image. Watts returns to it in the way of Zen and across his lecture series with obvious philosophical relish. There is a gate, and one must pass through it. But the gate has no gate. The obstacle is not an external barrier that could in principle be dismantled or circumvented. The obstacle is the very act of treating it as an obstacle. The gate is gateless because the thing standing between the seeker and enlightenment is the seeking itself. Watts distills this into a formulation he returns to repeatedly. The more you try to get it, the more you push it away. This is not a quirk of Zen pedagogy. It is a precise description of how ego-driven consciousness works when it turns itself into its own object. This is what Watts calls the backwards law. And once you have seen it in the spiritual domain, you begin to find it operating everywhere that the ego attempts to manage its own inner states. You cannot decide to stop being anxious. The decision is made by the anxious self, which monitors its own anxiety and adds a layer of anxiety about the anxiety. The wisdom of insecurity traces this loop with particular care. The very act of trying to secure yourself against insecurity deepens the insecurity, because the attempt confirms that there is something to be afraid of. You cannot will yourself into happiness. The willing is itself a dissatisfaction with the present state, which is the root of unhappiness. You cannot try to be spontaneous. The trying is the antithesis of spontaneity. You cannot force yourself into the present moment. The act of forcing is a flight from it, a future-directed effort to arrive somewhere you already are. Each of these is the same philosophical knot, pulled tighter in a different location. The listener who has spent years trying to be less anxious, or more present, or more genuinely themselves, is not encountering a new idea here. They are encountering the name of something they have already lived. The backwards law is not a theoretical construct, but a description of a structure that has been operating in ordinary experience without ever being clearly seen. The resolution of this knot is not another technique. Watts is emphatic on this point, because the temptation is to treat the insight as a new strategy. Now that I know that trying makes it worse, I will try to stop trying. Part 4. The Way of the Tao. The opening line of the Tao Te Ching is among the most philosophically compressed statements in the history of human thought. Lao Tzu writes, "The Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao." Alan Watts regarded this sentence as something close to perfect, not as mystical throat-clearing before the real content begins, but as the real content itself. It announces, in 11 words, the central problem of all philosophy, that the ultimate nature of reality outruns every concept we use to grasp it. The map is not the territory. The word is not the thing. And in this case, the thing in question is not some particular feature of the world, but the ground of the world itself. In Tao, the Watercourse Way, his final major work, completed just before his death in 1973 and published posthumously in 1975, Watts describes the Tao with characteristic philosophical care. It is not a god. It is not a principle in the logical sense. It is not a substance or a force or a being of any kind. It is, rather, the condition of possibility for all beings. This formulation is philosophically precise in a way that matters enormously. The Tao is not a thing among things. It cannot be placed alongside rocks and rivers and human beings as one more item in the inventory of what exists. It is, instead, what makes the existence of rocks and rivers and human beings possible at all. Watts draws a careful distinction here. To name the Tao is already to have reduced it to something smaller than it is, to have made it into an object of thought rather than the ground from which thought itself emerges. The immediate objection writes itself. If the Tao cannot be named, cannot be described, cannot be conceptualized, a philosophy built around an ineffable foundation seems to offer nothing but dignified silence. Watts takes this objection seriously, and his answer is characteristically precise. The Tao cannot be captured, but it can be pointed at. His preferred rendering is not the way in any prescriptive or moralistic sense, but something closer to the grain of the universe, the natural tendency of things, the direction in which reality moves when it is not being forced or manipulated or redirected by anxious human will. In the Watercourse Way, he offers a formulation that rewards careful attention. This is not mystical vagueness. It is a precise philosophical claim about the self-organizing intelligence of reality. The Tao is visible, or rather feelable, only when the ego's habitual interference is suspended long enough for the underlying order to show itself. Water is Lao Tzu's governing image for this, and Watts returns to it throughout his work. Water does not force its way. It finds the lowest point, takes the path of least resistance, and in doing so shapes landscapes, carves canyons, sustains life. It is, in the Taoist vision, the most powerful force in the natural world, precisely because it does not insist on its own direction. The soft overcomes the hard. The yielding overcomes the resistant. This is not passivity. It is intelligence of a different and deeper order than the kind that works by imposition. The contrast with Western assumptions about nature is philosophically explosive, and Watts develops it at length. In the dominant Western picture, nature is essentially passive material awaiting organization by human intelligence and will. The world is raw stuff. The mind is the shaper. This is the metaphysical foundation of the engineering mentality, and it runs far deeper than technology. It structures the Western understanding of what it means to be a self, to have a life, to pursue a goal. The Taoist picture inverts this entirely. Nature is already intelligent. It is already organized, already moving with something that functions like purpose, already expressing an order that precedes and exceeds anything human purpose could achieve. Watts draws a vivid contrast in the watercourse way between the Western engineer, who imposes a predetermined design onto passive materials, and the Taoist craftsman, who follows the grain of the wood. The craftsman is not passive. He works with great skill and intention, but his intention is responsive rather than imposing. He reads the material, feels its tendencies, and works with them rather than against them. The standard translation of Wu Wei as non-action or non-doing has caused more philosophical confusion than almost any other rendering of a Chinese concept into English. Alan Watts insisted on this point throughout his later work, particularly in The Watercourse Way, his final and perhaps most mature engagement with Taoist philosophy. Non-action suggests passivity, withdrawal, a kind of spiritual inertia. It conjures the image of someone sitting motionless whilst the world moves around them, refusing to participate. That is precisely the opposite of what the Taoists meant, and it is precisely the opposite of what Watts found so philosophically compelling about the concept. Watts's preferred formulation was not forcing. The distinction is philosophically precise. Wu Wei does not describe the quantity of action but its quality. The difference between ordinary ego-driven action and Wu Wei is not that one involves effort and the other does not. It is that one action is imposed upon a situation by the ego's agenda, and the other arises naturally from the situation itself. The Taoist term that illuminates this quality is ziran, which translates roughly as self-sowness or naturalness. Ziran describes the way a plant grows, the way water finds its level, the way clouds form and disperse. Nothing forces these processes. They unfold according to their own inner logic, responsive to their conditions, perfectly adapted to what is actually present. Wu Wei is action that carries this same quality into human life. The examples Watts draws upon throughout his work are not merely illustrative. They are philosophically precise demonstrations of what Wu Wei actually looks like in practice. He returned repeatedly to the Japanese art of judo, whose name translates literally as the gentle way. The practitioner of judo does not oppose their opponent's force with equal or greater force. They receive it, redirect it, allow it to flow through them and past them, using the opponent's own momentum as the instrument of their defeat. The result is more effective than brute resistance, and it requires a fraction of the effort. What makes it work is not weakness, but a particular kind of attentiveness, a responsiveness to what is actually happening rather than an imposition of what the ego wants to happen. The carpenter in The Watercourse Way offers the same lesson in a different register. Watts describes a craftsman so deeply in tune with the grain of the wood, so genuinely responsive to the material in front of them, that the work seems to proceed of its own accord. The carpenter is not doing nothing. They are working, and working with great skill. But their action is not a contest between the ego's will and the resistance of the material. It is a conversation, a collaboration, a kind of listening made, physical. The wood reveals where it wants to go, and the craftsman follows. This is Wu Wei as a mode of action, not an absence of it. There is a connection here to the paradox explored in the Zen tradition. The double bind at the heart of ego striving is that every effort to escape the ego reinforces it. The harder you try to become enlightened, the more firmly you entrench the very self that is supposedly the problem. Zen's critical method exposes this bind with great precision, but offers no direct resolution. Taoism, as Watts understood it, provides the positive resolution that Zen's negations point toward. If the ego's striving is the problem, the answer is not more striving in a different direction. It is a transformation in the quality of action itself. Watts formulated this in the watercourse way with characteristic clarity. The Taoist sage does not pursue happiness, wisdom, or virtue as goals. These arise naturally when the frantic pursuit is abandoned. This is the backwards law stated in its Taoist form. Wu Wei is not a technique for achieving goals more efficiently. It is a way of being in which goals and their achievement are no longer the organizing principle of experience. The sage is not indifferent to the world. They are, in a genuine sense, more engaged with it than the person driven by ego ambition, because their engagement is fully responsive rather than filtered through a predetermined agenda. The Taoist proverb that Watts returned to most insistently captures this with elegant economy. Muddy water is best cleared by leaving it alone. The attempt to clarify it by stirring produces only more turbidity. The water clears when the interference stops. Water is the governing image of the Tao Te Ching. Lao Tzu returns to it again and again, and Alan Watts made it the organizing metaphor of his final major work, published posthumously in 1975. The title itself, The Watercourse Way, names the central philosophical insight that the Tao moves as water moves, and that a life lived in harmony with reality takes on the character of water. Watts quotes Lao Tzu directly. Nothing in the world is as soft and yielding as water. Yet for dissolving the hard and inflexible, nothing can surpass it. This is not merely a poetic observation. It is a philosophical argument about the nature of strength itself. Water does not fight the contours of the landscape. It follows them. It yields to every obstacle, flows around every resistance, takes the shape of whatever contains it. And yet, given sufficient time, water dissolves granite. Rivers carve canyons. The softest substance wears away the hardest rock, not through force, but through patient, unrelenting responsiveness. The strength of water lies precisely in its willingness to yield, its refusal to insist on any particular form. This is what Watts means by Wu Wei as a mode of power rather than a mode of passivity. The watercourse way is the Taoist model of a life that moves with the grain of reality rather than against it, and in doing so achieves what no amount of direct force could accomplish. The Tao Te Ching extends this vision into a celebration of emptiness that Watts develops at length in the watercourse way. The usefulness of a bowl is not in its walls but in the hollow space the walls enclose. The usefulness of a room is not in the ceiling and floor, but in the empty volume they define. A wheel turns on the emptiness at its hub. Without the hollow, the bowl cannot hold water. Without the space, the room cannot be inhabited. Watts draws a philosophical point from this that goes well beyond the practical. The self that is most alive and most responsive is not the self that is densely packed with plans, opinions, and fixed agendas. It is the self that maintains a quality of openness, a readiness to receive what the situation actually offers, rather than what the ego has decided it ought to offer. The Taoist sage is not empty in the sense of being vacant or without character. They are empty in the sense of being unobstructed. Watts formulates this with characteristic precision. The usefulness of emptiness is that it can be filled. The sage meets each moment without the accumulated weight of predetermined responses. This connects directly to the Zen quality of what Shunryu Suzuki called beginner's mind, the openness that allows genuine encounter with experience rather than the mere confirmation of what one already believes. Both traditions are pointing at the same quality, a kind of alert receptivity that is the precondition for any authentic response to the world. This vision of emptiness and flexibility illuminates something important about the critique of the separate self that has been running through this series. The ego that is desperately trying to control its environment is like a clenched fist. There is a kind of strength in it, but it is a strength that has made itself rigid. A clenched fist cannot receive anything. It cannot respond flexibly to what the situation actually requires. It is committed. The Taoist alternative is not a limp hand, but an open hand, capable of both giving and receiving, both acting and yielding, as the moment demands. The distinction matters enormously. Watts is not advocating passivity or the abdication of will. He is describing a more sophisticated and more effective relationship with reality, one in which action arises from genuine attentiveness rather than from the ego's anxious need to assert control. Watts draws on a passage from the Tao Te Ching to show how this transforms the entire economy of a life. The sage does not hoard. The more he helps others, the more he benefits. The more he gives to others, the more he gets himself. This is not ethical instruction in the conventional sense. It is a description of how things actually work when the clenched fist of the ego releases its grip. The natural flow of reality is generous and self-replenishing. The person who lives in Wu Wei participates in that generosity rather than interrupting it. Part 5. The Vedantic Vision. The most philosophically radical claim in the history of human thought may not belong to Descartes, Kant, or Hegel. It belongs to a body of texts composed in ancient India, and it can be stated in 3 Sanskrit words: Tat, Tvam, Asi. That art thou. This is the central teaching of the Upanishads, the foundational texts of Indian philosophy developed over centuries of sustained inquiry into the nature of consciousness, self, and reality. Alan Watts returned to this formula throughout his career, treating it in the book On the Taboo Against Knowing Who You Are, in The Joyous Cosmology, and across his lecture series Out of Your Mind as the most complete and philosophically rigorous response to the problem of the skin-encapsulated ego. The claim is not that you resemble the ultimate nature of things, nor that you are connected to it, nor that you might one day be united with it through sufficient spiritual effort. The claim is that you are it. The individual self, Atman, is identical with Brahman, the ground of all being, the one consciousness that constitutes the whole of reality. There is one awareness in the universe. What you call yourself is that awareness, regarding itself from a particular angle. Watts was insistent on distinguishing this position from the ones it is most easily confused with, because the confusion matters philosophically. Pantheism holds that God is the sum total of all existing things, which still preserves a distinction between the divine totality and its individual parts. The Christian mystical tradition, even in its most elevated expressions, typically maintains some residual distinction between the soul and God, a gap that union closes but does not fully dissolve. The Vedantic claim is stronger and stranger than either. You are not a fragment of Brahman, not a spark of the divine fire, not a wave that will eventually merge back into the ocean. You are Brahman, wholly and presently. The sense of being a separate, bounded self is not a diminished form of Brahman. It is Brahman playing at being separate. Watts rendered this in the book with characteristic precision. You are a function of what the whole universe is doing, in the same way that a wave is what the whole ocean is doing. The wave is not a piece of ocean that has broken off. It is the ocean. moving in a particular way. The implication that follows from this is easy to overlook but philosophically decisive. If the identity of Atman and Brahman is the present nature of reality rather than a future state to be earned, then the Vedantic vision entirely transforms what spiritual inquiry is for. You have never been anything other than Brahman. There is no moment at which you cease to be it, no condition under which the identity is suspended. The sense of separation, the experience of being a self enclosed within a body, navigating a world of objects and other selves, is not an error that needs correcting. It is the universe playing a game with itself. Watts put it directly in his lectures. You are the universe, pretending to be a human being. The pretense is not a failure. It is the point. This reframes the entire project of seeking. If you are already what you are looking for, then the search is not a path toward the goal, but an obstacle to recognizing it. The backwards law, which we examined in the context of Watts's treatment of anxiety and control, reappears here at the deepest metaphysical level. The effort to become enlightened, to achieve union with Brahman, presupposes a separation that does not actually exist. The seeking reinforces the very illusion it claims to dissolve. Recognition is not achievement. It is the cessation of a particular kind of straining. This is where the concept of Maya becomes essential, and where its common mistranslation as simple illusion misleads. Maya derives from Sanskrit roots associated with measurement, making, and magic. It is the creative power by which the one reality appears as the many, the process by which Brahman divides, categorizes, names, and experiences itself as a world of distinct things. The world of Maya is not a hallucination to be seen through and discarded. It is an artwork generated with the full creative force of the Absolute. The multiplicity is real as appearance. What Maya conceals is not the world itself, but the identity of the one who is doing the appearing. Watts drew on this sense of artistry deliberately. There is a formula in Mahayana Buddhism that Alan Watts returns to again and again across his lectures and his books, a formula so compact and so radical that it tends to be either dismissed as a paradox or quietly set aside as too difficult to unpack. The formula is this. Watts treated it not as a riddle but as a precise philosophical claim, and understanding it properly is essential to understanding what his entire engagement with Eastern philosophy was actually about. Samsara is the Sanskrit term for the ordinary world of experience, the world of change, of impermanence, of apparent multiplicity and suffering. In popular Buddhist understanding, and in a great deal of Western spiritual culture that has absorbed Buddhism at a surface level, samsara is the realm one seeks to escape. It is the world of birth and death, of craving and frustration, of the endless cycle that grinds the individual down. Nirvana, in this popular reading, is the realm beyond it, the state of peace, liberation, and permanent release from all that difficulty. The spiritual path, on this account, is the journey from one to the other. Watts argued, drawing extensively on his treatment in the way of Zen and psychotherapy East and West, that this popular understanding is a fundamental misreading, not a minor misreading, not a simplification that captures something true even if imprecisely, but a misreading that inverts the actual teaching and generates, in its place, a form of spirituality that is itself a sophisticated expression of everything the teaching was designed to dissolve. The structural analysis Watts offers here is philosophically precise. The ego, confronted with the impermanence and uncertainty of ordinary experience, constructs a goal. In ordinary life, that goal takes the form of wealth, security, status, love, some arrangement of circumstances that promises to make things finally, permanently, all right. The ego knows, at some level, that these arrangements never quite deliver what they promise. But the response to that knowledge is not to abandon the strategy, but to refine it. Perhaps the problem is that the goal was not ambitious enough, not spiritual enough. And so the ego constructs a new goal, enlightenment, heaven, liberation, that promises what the ordinary goals could not, a final, stable, permanent state beyond all difficulty. Watts put the point with characteristic directness in psychotherapy, East and West. The person who is seeking nirvana as an escape from samsara has not transcended the ego. They have given the ego a new project. The structure is identical. The desire for security, the flight from the present, the refusal to accept things as they are, all of this persists, dressed now in spiritual language and pointed toward a spiritual horizon. This is the backwards law operating at its most subtle. The very intensity of the seeking guarantees the absence of what is sought. Watts found the corrective to this misreading in the Mahayana tradition itself, particularly in the Prajnaparamita literature and in the philosophy of Nagarjuna, who argued with rigorous precision that nirvana and samsara cannot be separated because they are not two different things. Nirvana is not a place. It is not a state that one enters and thereafter inhabits permanently, safely insulated from the flux of ordinary experience. It is a quality of seeing, a transformed relationship to the very world one already inhabits. The Zen tradition makes this concrete in a way that Watts found endlessly useful. Before enlightenment, chop wood and carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood and carry water. The activities are identical. The world has not changed. What has changed is the quality of presence brought to it, the ease with which one moves through it, the absence of that constant inner friction that comes from fighting reality rather than moving with it. Watts wrote in The Way of Zen that the Zen master's enlightenment is not a departure from the human condition but its fullest expression. This is the philosophical hinge on which everything turns. The implication for Watts's broader vision is profound. Liberation, properly understood, is not the end of the game. It is the discovery that the game was worth playing all along. The point is not to achieve a permanent state of bliss in which all impermanence has been eliminated and all difficulty dissolved. The most distinctive and philosophically daring contribution Watts makes to the Vedantic framework is not his account of Maya, nor his critique of the separate self, nor even his synthesis of Eastern and Western thought. It is his elaboration of a single Sanskrit concept that reconfigures everything. Lila. In the tradition, Lila refers to the spontaneous, purposeless, joyful activity of the divine, not the purposeful labor of a creator working toward a goal, not the moral seriousness of a judge administering a test, but the free, exuberant play of a child who runs and builds and tumbles for no reason beyond the sheer delight of running and building and tumbling. Watts develops this concept across the book, The Joyous Cosmology, and his lecture series Out of Your Mind into something far more ambitious, a complete cosmological vision. The universe, on this account, is not a machine running toward a terminus. It is not a problem awaiting solution. It is not a fallen state requiring redemption. It is a game being played by the one consciousness with itself, for the intrinsic joy of the playing. Watts insists this is not metaphor. It is his serious philosophical claim about the nature of reality. The weight of that claim becomes clear when held against the dominant Western pictures of existence. The mechanistic cosmos has a purpose built into its structure: entropy, heat, death, the arrow of time, pointing toward a final state. The theological cosmos has a moral architecture: creation, fall, redemption, judgment. Both frameworks share the assumption that the universe is going somewhere, that the present moment derives its significance from what it produces or what it atones for. Lila refuses this entirely. The game is its own justification. The present moment of playing is not instrumental to anything beyond itself. And this is not a counsel of nihilism. It is, Watts argues, the only framework that can account for the sheer gratuitousness of existence, the fact that there is something, rather than nothing, that the universe erupts into complexity and beauty and consciousness without any external compulsion to do so. The wave ocean image Watts returns to repeatedly gains its deepest resonance within this framework. Each individual consciousness is the universe playing at being a separate self. The forgetting of one's true nature, the experience of being a bounded, skin-encapsulated ego surrounded by an alien world, is not a cosmic accident. It is not a fall from grace. It is the condition of the game. Watts articulates this in the book with characteristic precision. You cannot play hide and seek unless you genuinely forget where you are hiding. The game requires real concealment. If the universe played at being a separate self, whilst simultaneously remembering it was the universe, there would be no game, only a performance with a winking actor. The ego's predicament, its anxiety, its sense of isolation and contingency, is not a mistake to be corrected. It is a move in a game. Understanding this does not dissolve the experience of separateness, but it transforms one's relationship to it. The anxiety remains, but it no longer has the quality of a cosmic emergency. It has the quality of the tension that makes the game worth playing. This transformation of meaning is precisely what Lila offers as a response to the question of human existence. If the universe is playing a game with itself, and the individual is the universe, then a life, with all its confusion and pleasure and struggle and illumination, is not a problem to be solved but a game to be played. Watts makes this explicit in his lectures. The meaning of life is just to be alive. It is so plain and so obvious and so simple, and yet everybody rushes around in a great panic as if it were necessary to achieve something beyond themselves. The Vedantic answer to the question of meaning is not that meaning must be found, nor that it must be created through existential commitment. Meaning is the intrinsic quality of the game itself, present at every moment of the playing, not awaiting some future vindication. This is where Lila completes and deepens the anti-escapist reading of Nirvana. The game is not played in some other realm. It is played here, in this world, in this body, in this life, as it actually unfolds. Part 6. The Illusion of Time. The skin-encapsulated ego, as we explored earlier in this series, is not merely a philosophical error. It is a way of living, and it has consequences that reach into every corner of experience. One of the most pervasive of those consequences is the ego's characteristic relationship to time. The separate self, perpetually anxious about its own continuity, does not live in the present. It lives in the future. It plans, anticipates, worries, and prepares. The present moment is not experienced as the place where life actually happens, but as a brief, unstable platform from which to launch into the next moment. In The Wisdom of Insecurity, Watts describes this condition with characteristic precision. The ego exists in a state of perpetual temporal displacement, always somewhere other than where it actually is. The body is here, the mind is elsewhere, rehearsing futures that may never arrive, and mourning pasts that cannot be recovered. This is not incidental to the ego's structure. It is essential to it. The separate self is, at its core, a project of self-construction and self-protection. It is always building something, always shoring up its position, always trying to make tomorrow more secure than today. And that project, by its very nature, can only be conducted in imagination, which means it can only be conducted in time. The present moment, stripped of memory and anticipation, offers the ego nothing to work with. It is the one place where the ego's project grinds to a halt. So the ego avoids it, instinctively and systematically, in favor of a mental life conducted almost entirely in the future tense. What makes this condition so tenacious is that Western culture does not merely permit it. It actively enforces it. From the earliest years of childhood, the message is consistent and relentless. The present is preparation for the future. School is preparation for university. University is preparation for a career. The career is preparation for retirement. And retirement, arrived at finally and exhaustedly, is too often preparation for death. Watts called this the great postponement, and the term captures something precise. It is not merely that individuals defer genuine living to a later date. It is that the culture is structurally organized around that deferral. The present moment is assigned no intrinsic value. It is always instrumental, always a means to something else. In The Wisdom of Insecurity, Watts wrote that we are living in a culture entirely hypnotized by the illusion of time. The hypnosis is not a personal failing. It is the water in which the Western ego swims. The great postponement would be merely tragic if it eventually delivered what it promised. But it does not, and it cannot, because of the self-defeating structure at the heart of goal obsession itself. The goal is always just over the horizon. When it is reached, the satisfaction that was supposed to accompany it is replaced, almost immediately, by a new goal. The ego does not rest upon achievement. It relocates its anxiety to the next objective. Watts saw this not as a psychological quirk, but as a structural feature of the ego's existence. The separate self is a project that can never be completed, because its completion would mean its dissolution. So it perpetuates itself through perpetual striving, perpetual becoming, perpetual deferral of the contentment it claims to be pursuing. This connects directly to what we examined as the backwards law. Watts formulated it with elegant economy in The Wisdom of Insecurity. The desire for security and the feeling of insecurity are the same thing. The very act of trying to secure the future is a constant, vivid reminder of how insecure it is. Every plan made against uncertainty is simultaneously an acknowledgement of uncertainty. Every precaution taken against loss is a reminder of what can be lost. The attempt to eliminate anxiety about the future generates precisely the anxiety it is designed to resolve. The ego runs harder on a treadmill that accelerates with each step. What this reveals is something philosophically significant. The ego's relationship to time is not a separate problem from the fundamental misidentification at the root of Western selfhood. It is the same problem, expressed temporally. The self that experiences itself as separate and vulnerable in space also experiences itself as precarious and threatened in time. And if that is so, then a transformed relationship to time is not merely a therapeutic adjustment. The ordinary Western understanding of the present moment is quietly devastating. It defines the present as a knife edge between past and future, an infinitesimally thin instant that is always already gone before you can grasp it. The moment you try to locate yourself in the present, it has vanished. This makes the present seem not like a home, but like a trap door, perpetually opening beneath your feet. And Watts, particularly in The Wisdom of Insecurity and his lecture series Out of Your Mind, argues that this understanding is not a neutral description of how time works. It is a product of the verbal, analytical mind. the mind that divides continuous experience into discrete units and then tries to locate itself within them, as though experience were a film strip and consciousness a projector trying to pause on a single frame. Direct experience does not present itself this way. When you are genuinely absorbed in something, time does not feel like a knife edge. It feels like a field, rich and textured, layered with depth. Memory and anticipation are present within that field, but they are present experiences, not windows onto other times. The sound of a piece of music includes what has just been played and leans towards what is coming next, and both of these are part of what you are hearing now. The analytical mind, however, insists on treating memory as the past and anticipation as the future, and by doing so, it evacuates the present of almost all its content. What remains is precisely nothing. That infinitesimal hairline that seems to offer no foothold at all. The ego, finding nothing to stand on in the present, retreats into memory and anticipation as its primary habitats, which is precisely why so much of ordinary human experience is experienced at one remove from itself. What Watts calls the eternal now is the correction to this. The word eternal here is easily misunderstood. It does not mean endless duration, time stretching forward and backward without limit. It means timelessness, the quality of experience in which the distinction between past, present, and future temporarily dissolves, not because memory and anticipation disappear, but because they are recognized as dimensions of the present rather than as exits from it. In The Wisdom of Insecurity, Watts writes that the present moment is the only moment available to us, and it is the door to all moments. That formulation is precise. The present is not one moment among many. It is the only mode of access to any moment at all. The past is available to you only as a present memory. The future is available to you only as a present anticipation. There is no other place from which experience occurs. This is not a mystical state reserved for advanced practitioners of meditation. It is the ordinary experience of genuine absorption, in music, in physical work, in conversation that has caught fire, in any moment of complete attention. In those moments, the verbal commentary that normally runs alongside experience, naming, judging, comparing, planning, falls temporarily silent. And what remains is experience itself, vivid and sufficient. The eternal now is not something to be achieved. It is what experience actually is when the mind's compulsive editorializing is briefly suspended. Watts formulated the philosophical stakes with characteristic directness in his lectures. We are living in a culture entirely hypnotized by the illusion of time, in which the so-called present moment is felt as nothing but an infinitesimal hairline between an all-powerfully causative past and an absorbingly important future. The hypnosis is not broken by eliminating memory and anticipation. It is broken by recognizing them as present experiences rather than as escapes from the present. Everything that has ever happened has happened now. Everything that will ever happen will happen now. The past does not exist in the past. It exists as memory, which is occurring at this moment. The future does not exist in the future. It exists as anticipation, which is also occurring at this moment. The present is not a thin slice of time. It is the only mode of existence that is fully real. There is a formulation Watts returns to more than once that carries unusual philosophical weight. The present moment always will have been. It sounds at first like a grammatical curiosity, a tense that the language barely accommodates. But the point is serious. Whatever is happening now is, in a precise sense, permanent. Alan Watts wrote The Wisdom of Insecurity in 1951, at 36 years old. in the period immediately following his departure from the episcopal priesthood. It is among his most concentrated works, leaner than the later lectures, less expansive than the books that followed, and marked by a quality of philosophical honesty that comes from having genuinely lived through the problem he is describing. Watts was not theorizing about insecurity from a position of comfortable detachment. He had relinquished a vocation, a role, an institutional identity. He knew, from the inside, what it felt like to have the structures of certainty removed. The wisdom of insecurity is what emerged from that experience, and it remains one of the most precise treatments of the ego's relationship with time that Western philosophy has produced. The backwards law, which we traced in its general form earlier in this series, finds its most consequential application here. The ego's attempt to make the future secure is not merely futile. It is counterproductive in a very specific way. Every effort to eliminate uncertainty, to guarantee outcomes, to insulate oneself from loss, functions as a continuous reminder of how much uncertainty actually exists. The act of seeking security is itself the most vivid possible demonstration of insecurity. The more elaborate the defenses, the more sharply they illuminate what they are defending against. Watts understood this as the central paradox of the ego's temporal existence. The very faculty that was supposed to protect us from anxiety becomes the primary engine of anxiety's production. This is not simply a restatement of the general principle. It has a specific texture in the domain of time. The ego's characteristic relationship with the future is one of attempted control. It plans, it anticipates, it rehearses outcomes, it constructs scenarios, and in doing so, it perpetually displaces itself from the only moment in which anything actually happens. Watts called this the great postponement, and it operates as both cause and consequence of the ego's insecurity. The refusal to inhabit the present generates anxiety about the future, and anxiety about the future deepens the refusal to inhabit the present. The ego circles endlessly within this structure, each revolution tightening the loop. Watts's formulation is precise. The more you try to hold on to life, the more it slips through your fingers. The attempt to grasp happiness in the future produces unhappiness now. The attempt to control what has not yet happened produces a more acute awareness of how much lies beyond control. The solution Watts proposes is not indifference to the future, and it is not a counsel of passivity. It is a transformed relationship to uncertainty itself. The person who has genuinely accepted the fundamental insecurity of existence does not become reckless or disengaged. They become, paradoxically, more effective. Freed from the paralyzing effort of trying to control the uncontrollable, they can respond to what is actually happening with greater clarity and flexibility. Watts put it directly. The only way to make sense out of change is to plunge into it, move with it, and join the dance. This is not resignation. It is a reorientation of intelligence toward reality as it actually presents itself, rather than toward a fantasized version of reality that the ego is trying to enforce. This is precisely the Taoist concept of wu-wei, applied to the ego's relationship with time. Wu-wei is not inaction. It is action that is not in conflict with the nature of things. The wisdom of insecurity is wu-wei in the temporal domain, a way of moving through time that does not resist its fundamental character, which is change, impermanence, and the impossibility of final fixity. Watts saw this convergence clearly, and it is one of the places where his synthesis of Eastern and Western thought is most illuminating. The Taoist sage, the Zen practitioner, and the person who has genuinely absorbed the argument of the wisdom of insecurity are all describing the same orientation from different philosophical directions. The Zen connection runs through what Watts identified as the double bind. The impossibility of achieving, by deliberate effort, states that are only available in the absence of deliberate effort. Genuine security, genuine peace, genuine presence cannot be manufactured by the ego's striving. Part 7. The Nature of Consciousness. 30 years before David Chalmers gave it a name, Alan Watts was circling the same abyss. The hard problem of consciousness, as Chalmers would formally articulate it in 1995, can be stated with disarming simplicity, even if neuroscience one day produced a complete and exhaustive account of every physical process in the brain that correlates with conscious experience. Something would remain unexplained. We would know which neurons fire when you see red, which patterns of electrochemical activity accompany the sound of a cello, which cascades of molecular signaling underlie the sharp sting of grief. And yet, after all that description, we would still not have explained why any of it is accompanied by experience at all. Why is there something it is like to be you? This is not a question about mechanism. It is a question about the existence of the inner world itself. There is an explanatory gap between the physical and the experiential that no accumulation of neuroscientific detail seems capable of closing. Watts identified this gap with precision in The Joyous Cosmology, published in 1962, and returned to it throughout his lecture series on the nature of consciousness. His formulation is characteristically direct. The materialist account of mind fails to account for the most obvious and inescapable fact of existence. Not the most obscure fact, not a fact that requires instruments to detect, but the most immediate and undeniable one, that there is experience at all, that the lights are on. The failure of materialism here is not a failure of detail, but a failure of category. The materialist can describe everything that happens in the brain when you see red. The description can be as fine-grained and technically precise as you like, but the description will never contain the redness of red. The felt quality of that particular color, the way it arrests attention, the sheer there-ness of it in experience, will not appear anywhere in an account of wavelengths and photoreceptors and neural firing rates. Philosophers call this missing element qualia, the felt quality of experience, the what it is like dimension of conscious life. Watts puts it plainly in The Joyous Cosmology. The brain is not the mind. It is the instrument through which the mind works. This is not a mystical assertion. It is a precise philosophical observation. The materialist framework, for all its extraordinary success in describing the physical world, systematically excludes the very thing it is supposed to explain. It is as though someone offered a complete account of the physics of music, whilst insisting that sound itself was not part of the explanation. The obvious response to this inadequacy is dualism, the view that mind and matter are genuinely distinct substances, that consciousness belongs to a different order of reality from the physical brain. Descartes made this move in the 17th century, and it has haunted philosophy ever since. The trouble is that dualism does not solve the hard problem. It relocates it. If mind and matter are genuinely separate substances, how do they interact? How does a non-physical intention produce a physical movement? Descartes himself proposed the pineal gland as the site of interaction between soul and body, a suggestion that satisfied almost no one and has satisfied even fewer people since. Contemporary property dualism, which holds that consciousness is a non-physical property of physical systems, faces the same difficulty in a more sophisticated form. The interaction problem remains unanswered. Watts saw this clearly. The history of philosophy's attempts to bridge the gap between mind and matter is a history of increasingly ingenious failures. Dualism does not dissolve the explanatory gap. It simply draws a line across it and calls that a solution? Here, then, is the genuine philosophical impasse. Materialism cannot account for experience. Dualism cannot account for interaction. The conventional options have been exhausted, and both roads lead to the same wall. Something more radical is required, not a refinement of the existing frameworks, but an inversion of the assumptions that generated them. Watts's move is to question the starting point itself. The materialist framework has placed matter first and consciousness second, treating experience as something that emerges, somehow, from sufficiently complex arrangements of non-experiencing stuff. But this sequence, Watts argues in The Joyous Cosmology, has the relationship precisely backwards. There is a formulation that runs through Alan Watts's work with the consistency of a philosophical conviction rather than a rhetorical flourish. It appears in the book, in The Joyous Cosmology, across decades of lectures, and it never loses its precision. You are an aperture through which the universe is looking at and exploring itself. Watts was not offering a poetic consolation. He was making a serious philosophical claim about what consciousness is and where it belongs within the structure of reality. The claim rests on the foundations already established in this series. If the universe is a unified, self-organizing process, as both Taoist and Vedantic frameworks insist, then consciousness is not a strange intrusion into that process. It is not a ghost haunting a machine, not a mind inexplicably trapped inside matter. Consciousness is what the universe does when it reaches sufficient complexity. Through the long arc of biological evolution, through the elaboration of nervous systems and the emergence of reflective awareness, the universe has developed the capacity to observe itself, to know its own processes from the inside. Each individual mind is a point at which this self-knowledge becomes actual. You are not a separate observer stationed outside reality, peering in. You are reality becoming aware of itself at a particular location. Watts articulated this with characteristic directness in his lectures. Through our eyes, the universe is perceiving itself. Through our ears, the universe is listening to its harmonies. We are the witnesses through which the universe becomes conscious of its glory, its magnificence. This is not grandiosity. The statement carries no implication of human superiority or cosmic privilege. It is a precise philosophical description of the relationship between individual consciousness and universal reality. Your experiences, all of them, your perceptions of color and sound, your moments of grief and elation, your fleeting sense of beauty before something that moves you, these are not merely your experiences in any merely private sense. They are the universe's experiences. The boundary between what you call your inner life and what you call external reality is, at the deepest level, an artificial construction. This transforms the meaning of individual existence in ways that Watts considered genuinely liberating. The conventional picture places the human being as an accidental byproduct of blind physical processes, a temporary arrangement of matter that happened to develop awareness before dissolving back into unconsciousness. Watts found this picture not only philosophically untenable, but psychologically crippling. It produces the sensation of being fundamentally alien to the world, a stranger in a universe that neither knows nor cares about your presence. The aperture image dissolves this. You are not an accident the universe produced and then abandoned. You are the universe producing itself into self-knowledge. The cosmos has not merely generated you. It is, in a philosophically precise sense, what you are. There is a distinction here that Watts insisted upon with considerable care, because it is easy to hear the aperture image as a new form of anthropocentrism, a flattering story in which human consciousness sits at the pinnacle of a purposeful cosmic process. Watts rejected this reading entirely. The universe is not doing this for human beings. It is not unfolding toward humanity as its goal. treating conscious minds as the culmination of a teleological scheme. The philosophical precision of the aperture image lies exactly here. The universe is not doing this for you. You are the universe doing this. The shift is from the self as a privileged observer of reality to the self as a participant in reality, a mode of reality's own self-expression. In the book, Watts stated it with the directness he reserved for his most fundamental claims. You are not in the universe. You are the universe. This connects directly to the Vedantic identity of Atman and Brahman, explored earlier in this series. The aperture image is the cosmological expression of that metaphysical identity. What Vedanta articulates as a truth about the innermost nature of the self, the aperture image articulates as a truth about the structure of consciousness within the cosmos. They are the same insight approached from different directions. Consciousness, for Alan Watts, is not a single thing. It is not a uniform substance that either exists or does not, that is either present or absent. It is a spectrum, a vast, continuous range of modes of awareness, stretching from the most rudimentary flicker of sensory registration all the way through to the dissolved, luminous unity that the Vedantic tradition calls samadhi and the Zen tradition calls satori. Ordinary waking consciousness sits somewhere in the middle of this range, neither at its most contracted nor at its most expansive. The mistake of Western psychology and Western common sense alike has been to treat this middle point as the whole territory. In The Joyous Cosmology, published in 1962, Watts offered what he described as a serious attempt to describe the world as it appears under the influence of psychedelic substances and to show how this appearance relates to the world as described by mystics and physicists. The book is frequently misread as a celebration of drug experience for its own sake. It is nothing of the kind. It is a philosophical document, using the dissolution of ordinary perceptual categories as a lens through which to examine the structure of consciousness itself. What Watts found, and what the book carefully articulates, is that the spectrum of awareness does not represent higher or lower grades of a single substance. Each point on it is a genuinely different mode of the universe's self-awareness. Dreaming is not a degraded form of waking. Deep sleep is not an absence of consciousness, but a mode of it. Samadhi is not waking consciousness intensified. It is waking consciousness transformed into something qualitatively other. This has a consequence that Watts considered crucial. He resisted, with considerable philosophical force, the common assumption that mystical or meditative states involve a special faculty unavailable to ordinary people or a supernatural intervention from outside the natural order. The boundaries between ordinary and extraordinary consciousness, he argued, are far more permeable than Western culture assumes. What distinguishes the state of absorbed, unified attention that the contemplative traditions describe is not its supernatural origin, but its quality of attention. Ordinary waking consciousness is characterized by what Watts called the commentary mode, the running internal narrative, the constant self-referential chatter, the perpetual translation of raw experience into verbal categories. Mystical states represent a shift out of this mode into something more direct, more receptive, more unified. The experience is not added to consciousness from outside. It is what consciousness discovers when the commentary falls quiet. This democratizes the mystical traditions in a way that Watts found both philosophically honest and humanly important. The insights of Vedanta, of Zen, of the Sufi poets are not the exclusive property of advanced practitioners who have spent decades in disciplined practice. They are descriptions of modes of awareness that are, in principle, available to anyone, because they are descriptions of what consciousness itself is capable of when its habitual contractions are released. The tradition does not own the experience, it merely maps it. The map is useful, but the territory belongs to no one, because it is the ground of everyone. The philosophical consequence of this spectrum model reaches back through everything Watts has been building. The insights at the center of his vision, the illusory nature of the separate, skin-encapsulated ego, the identity of Atman and Brahman, the wisdom of insecurity, the liberating logic of Wu Wei, are not conclusions to be added to one's stock of beliefs. They cannot be possessed intellectually and then stored away. They are transformations of one's mode of awareness. To understand them in the way Watts intends is not to know something new but to perceive differently. In the joyous cosmology, he was explicit that his purpose was not to describe the experiences themselves, but to show that they are consistent with the most advanced thinking in physics, philosophy, and the study of religion. The claim is not that altered states are authoritative because they are dramatic. The claim is that the philosophical vision they illuminate is coherent, that it holds together across multiple independent traditions of inquiry, from quantum physics to Vedanta to the philosophy of mind. The architecture is now complete in its broad outlines. Part Wit: The Critique of Western Religion. Alan Watts was not an outsider throwing stones at a tradition he barely understood. He was ordained as an Episcopal priest. He had read Meister Eckhart with genuine admiration, studied the anonymous mysticism of the cloud of unknowing, and engaged seriously with Jacob Boehmer's vision of the divine as a self-unfolding ground of being. His 1947 work, Behold the Spirit, and its companion, The Supreme Identity, 3 years later, are not critiques of Christianity but defenses of something within it that he believed had been systematically suppressed. The mystical strand of Western religion, he argued, expressed something genuinely profound: the possibility of a direct, unmediated encounter with the ground of existence that dissolved the boundary between the human and the divine. His quarrel was never with that tradition. His quarrel was with what had replaced it at the institutional center of Western religious life. What replaced it, Watts argued, was what he called the religion of the cosmic boss. The phrase is deliberately blunt, and its bluntness is the point. The dominant theological image of God in Western Christianity is not the ineffable ground of being encountered in the mystical literature. It is an omnipotent, omniscient, personal sovereign who created the universe from nothing, legislates its moral order, and dispenses rewards and punishments according to a divine will that is ultimately inscrutable but absolutely binding. In the book, Watts formulated the essential critique with characteristic directness. The idea of God, as the cosmic boss, is the projection of the ego onto the cosmos. That single sentence contains the entire philosophical argument, though unpacking it requires care. The cosmic boss theology is not simply one image among many. It is a structural center around which an entire system of religious experience organizes itself. A God defined by sovereign power and moral authority generates a specific and entirely predictable kind of relationship between the worshipper and the divine. It is the relationship of a subject before a sovereign, a sinner before a judge, a creature before a creator whose demands must be discovered, whose standards must be met, and whose disappointment must be managed. The entire apparatus of sin, guilt, confession, absolution, and salvation is not incidental to this theology. It is its institutional expression. The religious life, under this image, becomes fundamentally a project of managed compliance. One must learn what the boss requires, conform to it as fully as possible, and navigate the consequences of inevitable failure. In The Two Hands of God, Watts traced how this theological structure shaped not just the content of Western religious experience, but its texture, its emotional register, and ultimately its understanding of what a human self fundamentally is. The philosophically decisive observation is this: the cosmic boss theology is structurally identical to the skin-encapsulated ego's experience of the world. Both are organized around the management of an anxious, isolated self in relation to a sovereign power it did not choose and cannot fully satisfy. The ego, as established earlier in this series, experiences itself as a separate center of awareness enclosed within a body, confronting a world that is fundamentally other, fundamentally indifferent, and fundamentally threatening. The cosmic boss theology does not transcend this predicament. It mirrors it. God, in this image, becomes the ultimate skin-encapsulated self, infinitely powerful, infinitely separate, infinitely demanding, and ultimately alone in his sovereignty. The religion that was supposed to liberate human beings from their isolation has, in this form, simply given the isolation a divine sanction. As Watts put it in the book, the God of Western theology is the ego writ large. This is why the critique matters philosophically, not merely as a piece of cultural history. The God of Western theology and the ego of Western psychology are mirror images of each other, both defined by their separateness, their sovereignty, and their underlying anxiety about what lies beyond their control. They reinforce each other. A culture organized around the skin-encapsulated ego will naturally produce a theology organized around a cosmic version of that same ego, and that theology will in turn validate and deepen the ego's sense of itself as the fundamental unit of reality. There is a strand running through the history of religion that institutional authority has always found deeply inconvenient. It does not belong to any single tradition. It surfaces in Christian monasteries and Sufi lodges, in the Upanishads and in the writings of the Jewish Kabbalists, in Zen monasteries and in the quiet corners of the Western contemplative tradition. Alan Watts called it the mystical tradition, and his central claim about it was precise. Mysticism is not the esoteric fringe of religion. It is religion's essential core. Every doctrine, every ritual, every institutional structure derives whatever genuine meaning it possesses from this experiential reality at the center. When contact with that center is lost, what remains is the shell without the kernel. The contrast Watts drew most insistently was with what he called cosmic boss theology, the picture of God as a supreme lawgiver, separate from and above the creation, demanding obedience from creatures who are fundamentally other than their creator. Against this, the mystical tradition has consistently pointed towards something entirely different, a direct, unmediated experience of the divine in which the ordinary categories of subject and object, self and God, simply dissolve. The formulation Watts returned to most frequently came from the 14th century German mystic Meister Eckhart. The eye through which I see God is the same eye through which God sees me. My eye and God's eye are one eye, one seeing, one knowing, one love. Watts treated this as the most precise Christian expression of what the Upanishads had established as Atman Brahman identity. The innermost self and the ground of all being are not two things in relationship. What the Vedantic tradition articulated as philosophical doctrine, Eckhart arrived at through direct contemplative experience and expressed in language that the Christian Church found profoundly threatening. That threat was not incidental. In Behold the Spirit and the Supreme Identity, Watts traced with considerable care the institutional suppression of the mystical tradition within Christianity. Eckhart's propositions were condemned by papal decree. The hesychast tradition within Eastern Christianity, which centered on the direct experience of divine light in contemplative prayer, was repeatedly marginalized by ecclesiastical authorities more comfortable with doctrinal conformity than with experiential depth. This pattern was not, for Watts, merely a historical curiosity. It was a structural analysis. Institutions have a systematic tendency to replace the living experience that generated them with the dead letter of doctrine. The original mystic has an experience that shatters the ordinary categories of selfhood and divinity. That experience is then described in words. The words become sacred texts. The texts require authoritative interpretation. The interpreters become a professional class with institutional interests in maintaining their interpretive authority. And somewhere in that process, the experience itself, the thing, the whole structure was originally built to transmit and protect, gets quietly buried beneath the accumulated weight of everything built on top of it. What Watts called organized religion in the pejorative sense is precisely this: a system of belief, authority, and social control that has forgotten what it was originally about. The constructive implication Watts drew from this diagnosis was characteristically direct. The recovery of the sacred does not require the invention of a new religion. It does not require the dismantling of existing traditions, though it does require a willingness to see through their institutional pretensions. What it requires is a quality of attention and openness that is available to any human being willing to look directly at their own experience and to allow that experience to be what it actually is, rather than what the verbal mind insists it must be. In Behold the Spirit, Watts wrote that the mystic is not a special kind of human being. Every human being is a special kind of mystic. This democratizes the mystical tradition in precisely the same way that the spectrum model of consciousness democratized the insights of meditative practice. The capacity for direct experience of the ground of being is not a rare gift distributed to exceptional individuals. It is the birthright of every conscious creature. At the very center of the skin-encapsulated ego lies a terror so fundamental that most of Western culture has organized itself, in large part, around not looking at it directly. The ego, by its very structure, is a project of self-preservation. It defines itself as a separate entity, bounded by skin, persisting through time, accumulating experience and identity. And death is the absolute refutation of that project. It is the one event that the ego cannot survive, cannot manage, cannot negotiate with. So Western culture, Watts argued, has done what frightened people generally do. It has looked away. The looking away takes several forms. The most elaborate is the theological narrative of personal immortality. The soul, in the dominant Western religious account, does not dissolve at death but continues, carrying its individual identity into an afterlife of reward or punishment. Watts analyzed this narrative carefully in the book, and across his lecture series, The Nature of Consciousness. The promise of personal immortality does not resolve the fear of death. It merely postpones the ego's problem, projecting it into an infinite future where the separate self continues to exist, continues to be judged, continues to carry the weight of its individual history. It is not a transformation of the ego's relationship to death, but a denial of death dressed in metaphysical clothing. The modern secular version is structurally identical. Death is treated as a medical failure, a problem that better technology will eventually solve, an embarrassing interruption to the project of progress. The dying are moved out of sight. Grief is pathologized and given a clinical timeline. The noise of modern life, Watts observed, serves a precise psychological function. It fills the silence in which the fact of mortality might otherwise become audible. This is not merely a personal psychological defense. It is, as Watts insisted, a culturally enforced taboo. To speak plainly about death, to sit with its reality, to allow it to alter the texture of how one lives, is treated as morbid, as giving up, as a failure of optimism. Buddhism offers a different starting point entirely. The concept of anicca, impermanence, is not a problem that Buddhist philosophy acknowledges reluctantly. It is the most fundamental characteristic of reality, and recognizing it clearly is the beginning of wisdom rather than the beginning of despair. Watts developed this at length in the way of Zen, drawing out the implication that the beauty of a cherry blossom is not diminished by its brevity. It is constituted by its brevity. A blossom that never fell would not be more beautiful. It would be something else entirely, something static, and therefore something less alive. The value of a moment is inseparable from its passing. To wish for permanence is not to wish for more life, but to wish for something other than life altogether. Taoism extends this into a different register. The wave does not cease to exist when it breaks on the shore. It returns to the ocean from which it was never truly separate. The individual life, in Watts's Taoist framing, is a temporary pattern within an ongoing process, a particular configuration of the same energy that moves through everything. Death is not the annihilation of something real, but the dissolution of a temporary form back into the process that generated it. The process itself continues, as it always has, endlessly elaborating new patterns out of itself. Vedanta completes the picture by making explicit what the other two traditions imply. The self that dies is the ego, the skin-encapsulated self, the persona. But the deeper self, Atman, is identical with Brahman, the ground of all being, which is not born and does not die. What perishes is the particular, the individual pattern. What does not perish is the reality in which all particular patterns arise and dissolve. Watts was careful, here, to distinguish his response from consolation. He was not offering a way of avoiding grief or softening the reality of loss. The death of a particular person, the ending of a particular moment, is genuinely painful. Grief is genuine. The loss of what is irreplaceable is real. What Watts offered was not an anesthetic but a reframing of what death means within a larger picture of reality. In The Wisdom of Insecurity, he wrote with characteristic directness, "The meaning of life is just to be alive." It is so plain and so obvious and so simple. Part 9. The Universe as Organism. The dominant cosmology of the modern West is not merely a scientific theory. It is a picture of reality so deeply embedded in our assumptions that most people never notice it operating. The universe, in this picture, is a machine, a vast, intricate, deterministic clockwork in which matter moves according to fixed laws, in which everything that happens is, in principle, the inevitable consequence of everything that preceded it, and in which there is no intrinsic intelligence, no genuine creativity, no self-organization of any kind. Nature is passive material. Mind is an anomaly, or perhaps an illusion. The cosmos proceeds mechanically, indifferently, without purpose or awareness. Watts traced this picture directly to the same intellectual inheritance that produced the skin-encapsulated ego and the cosmic boss theology. Descartes split mind from matter, leaving the material world as pure extension, pure mechanism, governed entirely by quantifiable forces. Newton provided the mathematics that made this picture extraordinarily productive, and the result was a cosmology that mirrored, at the scale of the universe, the same fundamental dualism that fractures the individual self from its world. The mechanical universe is not a neutral scientific description. It is the cosmological expression of a particular and very peculiar way of experiencing reality. In the book and throughout his lecture series, The Tao of Philosophy, Watts was insistent on a distinction that sounds simple but carries enormous weight. The mechanical model of the universe is not the universe. It is a model, an extraordinarily useful model, one of the greatest intellectual achievements in human history, but a model nonetheless. The map is not the territory, and the catastrophe of the modern West has been to mistake one for the other. The consequences of that confusion have been devastating in ways that extend far beyond the philosophical. When nature is understood as passive mechanism rather than living community, it becomes a resource, something to be extracted, processed, and consumed, rather than something to which one belongs and with which one is in relationship. Watts put it with characteristic directness in the book. We have been treating the world as though it were a collection of objects, rather than a community of subjects. And this is not merely an ethical failure. It is an expression of the same fundamental misidentification that was examined in the opening movements of this series. The skin-encapsulated ego and the mechanical universe are the same error operating at different scales. The individual who experiences himself as a separate, isolated unit, confronting an alien world, is living inside a cosmology. The mechanical universe is that cosmology made explicit, extended to encompass everything. To challenge one is necessarily to challenge the other. What makes Watts's argument particularly compelling is that he did not simply appeal to ancient wisdom traditions to counter the mechanical picture. He pointed to the developments within Western science itself. By the middle of the 20th century, the Newtonian Cartesian model had already been profoundly destabilized from within. Quantum mechanics had revealed that at the most fundamental level, particles are not independent billiard balls obeying deterministic laws. They are patterns of relationship, whose properties cannot be specified independently of the systems in which they participate and the observations by which they are measured. The hard boundaries between separate objects, so central to the mechanical picture, dissolve at the quantum scale into something far more fluid and interconnected. Ecology had revealed something equally subversive at the biological level. No organism exists independently of its environment. The organism and its environment co-constitute one another in a continuous, dynamic process. Gregory Bateson, whose work Watts engaged with seriously and whose influence appears throughout his later lectures, argued that the unit of survival is not the organism, but the organism plus environment. The individual creature is an abstraction from a larger pattern. Norbert Wiener's cybernetics had shown that complex systems exhibit self-organization and self-regulation that cannot be reduced to the behavior of their components in isolation. The whole, in a very precise and technical sense, is not the sum of its parts. There is a moment in Alan Watts's lecture series, The Tao of Philosophy, where he pauses and makes a claim so simple it sounds almost obvious, until you realize it dismantles the entire architecture of how Western culture understands the self. He says, "You are not a self in an environment. You are a self of your environment." The distinction is not semantic. It is the difference between two entirely different pictures of what a human being is. The organic vision of the universe developed in the previous section carries a direct and radical implication for the understanding of selfhood, and Watts pursues it with characteristic precision. If every entity in the universe is constituted by its relationships with its environment, then the boundary marked by your skin is not a wall. It is a membrane, a zone of intense exchange and interaction, not a line of separation between an inner self and an outer world. Your body is made of air, water, food, substances that were recently outside you and will shortly be outside you again. Your nervous system has been shaped by every relationship you have inhabited, every culture that formed you, every experience that left its mark on the way you perceive and respond. The self is not something that exists first and then enters into relationships with the world. The relationships are what the self is made of. Watts develops this with concrete biological detail in the book, On the Taboo Against Knowing Who You Are, his most direct philosophical statement. The boundary between organism and environment is, in biological terms, a fiction maintained for certain practical purposes. The lungs require air. The gut requires food. The skin requires warmth and pressure. The nervous system requires stimulation. Strip away the environment and you do not have a self that persists in isolation. You have nothing at all. The self is not a thing that inhabits the world like a driver inhabits a car. It is a process that the world is performing. What makes Watts's formulation philosophically precise rather than merely poetic is that it does not collapse individuality into uniformity. The ecological self is not a reductive claim. It does not say that you are nothing but your environment. That genuine individuality is an illusion to be discarded. It says something more subtle and more interesting, that individuality is a pattern within a larger process, not an entity separate from it. The wave is genuinely a wave. It has a real shape, a real direction, a real identity. It is not interchangeable with other waves, but it is not separate from the ocean that generates it, sustains it, and eventually reabsorbs it. The self is genuinely a self, but it is not separate from the universe that produces it. The formulation Watts offers in the book is precise enough to bear repeating. You did not come into this world. You came out of it, like a wave from the ocean. He insists this is not a metaphor. It is a description of the biological and ecological reality of individual existence. The universe did not create you as an external object placed within itself. It grew you from within itself, as an expression of its own nature. The distinction matters enormously because it changes the entire character of the relationship between self and world. You are not a stranger here. You are one of the things this universe does. The ethical dimension of this vision follows directly. If you are what your environment is doing, then the destruction of your environment is, in a very real sense, the destruction of yourself. The ecological crisis is not a problem located out there, threatening a self that remains intact in here. It is the skin-encapsulated ego conducting a war against its own foundations, in complete ignorance of what it actually is. Watts writes in the book that we are treating the world as if it were a collection of objects rather than a community of subjects. This is not a rhetorical flourish. It is a diagnosis of the practical consequence of the mechanical worldview. When the universe is understood as dead matter organized by external forces, the natural world becomes a resource. When it is understood as a living organism of which you are an expression, its degradation becomes self-mutilation. The ecological crisis, in Watts's analysis, is what the mechanical worldview looks like when it is lived out at civilizational scale. There is a misreading of Watts's cosmological vision that arises almost inevitably, and it is worth confronting directly. If the individual self is ultimately a pattern within a larger whole, a wave in the ocean, an aperture through which the universe looks at itself, does this not mean that individual differences are finally dissolved? That personal history, particular character, the specific texture of one's way of seeing and feeling, all of this is merely temporary, a kind of foam on the surface of something vast and featureless. The misreading is understandable. It follows from a certain picture of mystical experience as the erasure of the particular in favor of the universal. but it is precisely the picture that Watts spent his philosophical career dismantling. The universe, in Watts's vision, is not tending towards uniformity. It is endlessly, extravagantly inventive. It does not generate diversity as a temporary mistake to be corrected once consciousness matures. It generates diversity as the very content of its self-expression. In the book, Watts offers a formulation that cuts to the heart of this. The universe is not a collection of objects, but a community of subjects. Each subject irreplaceable, each perspective unique. The word community matters here. A community is not a mass. It is a gathering of distinct presences, whose distinctness is not incidental, but constitutive. Remove the particularity, and you have not achieved unity. You have destroyed the community. The universe, understood as a community of subjects, is richer for the diversity of its perspectives, not poorer. The philosophical ground of this celebration of particularity runs deep. Each wave is genuinely a wave. It has a real shape, a real direction, a real identity. The ocean does not diminish the wave by being the substance from which the wave is made. It enables the wave to be fully and completely what it is. The dissolution of the separate ego does not mean the dissolution of the particular self. It means the liberation of the particular self from the exhausting burden of defending its separateness. In one of his lecture series, Watts put this with characteristic precision. The universe is playing at being you, specifically, uniquely, irreplaceably. That word, playing, carries enormous philosophical weight, and we will return to it in the final movement of this exploration. But the immediate point is this: your particular personality, your particular history, your particular way of moving through the world and making sense of it, these are not obstacles to cosmic unity. They are the content of the cosmic game. They are what the universe is doing when it does you. This transforms the meaning of individual existence entirely. The question is no longer how to transcend one's particularity in order to achieve some purer, more universal state of being. The question is how to inhabit one's particularity without the constant self-monitoring and self-justification that the separate ego imposes. Watts draws on the Taoist concept of ziran here, a word that translates roughly as naturalness or self-so-ness, the quality of being exactly what one is, without effort or apology. A tree does not deliberate about being a tree. A wave does not justify its shape. They simply are what they are, with an unself-conscious completeness that Watts regarded as the model for human freedom. The Zen tradition points at the same quality with the phrase, just this. Not a diminishment of experience, but its full arrival. Experience without the overlay of self-consciousness that is always commenting, evaluating, and managing. In the book, Watts offers a formulation that crystallizes this. The fully alive person is not a person who has transcended their particularity, but a person who has stopped being embarrassed by it. That phrase, stopped being embarrassed, is deliberately ordinary. The liberation Watts describes is not a dramatic rupture with ordinary life. It is a shift in relationship to what is already there. The liberated self has not disappeared into a blank unity. It has simply stopped fighting itself. It has stopped treating its own particular shape as a problem requiring correction, and begun inhabiting that shape with the same unself-conscious ease that characterizes everything else the universe produces. This completes a significant arc in Watts's philosophical vision. Part 10. The Philosophy of Play. Of all the images Alan Watts returned to across 4 decades of writing and lecturing, one recurs with a consistency that suggests it was not merely illustrative, but genuinely central to his thinking. Music. Not music as metaphor, not music as decoration, but music as a structural model for what existence actually is. and how it is meant to be lived. You find it in the book on the taboo against knowing who you are. You find it threaded through the lecture series, and you find it delivered in that particular tone. Watts reserved for ideas he considered not just interesting, but urgent. The observation at the heart of it is disarmingly simple. The point of music is not to arrive at the final note. If it were, the greatest musicians would play as fast as possible, and the wisest audiences would skip directly to the closing bar. But no one does this, because everyone intuitively understands that to do so would be to miss the point entirely. The value of a piece of music is not located at its conclusion. It is distributed across every moment of its unfolding. The end of the piece is not the goal. It is the natural completion of a process that was already fully meaningful at each stage of its movement. Watts drew the implication directly. He argued that Western culture had understood life by analogy with a journey, a pilgrimage, with a serious purpose at the end, where the task was to arrive at success, or achievement, or perhaps heaven after death. And in organizing life around that arrival, it had missed the point the whole way along. As Watts put it was a musical thing, and you were supposed to sing or to dance while the music was being played. What makes this more than a poetic observation is the philosophical precision of the distinction it contains. In goal-directed activity, meaning is deferred. The activity derives its value from the result it produces, and until the result is achieved, the activity is purely instrumental. It is a means, and means are, by definition, subordinate to ends. The person grinding through work they dislike in order to earn a retirement they may never reach is living inside this structure completely. Every present moment is justified only by its contribution to a future moment, and the future moment, when it arrives, is immediately subordinated to the next future moment, meaning perpetually retreats. In music, this structure is reversed. Meaning is immanent. Each note has its full value in the moment of its sounding. The piece as a whole is not more meaningful than its individual moments. It is constituted by those moments. Remove any one of them, and you have not merely shortened the piece, you have altered its meaning throughout. The musician who plays every note as quickly as possible in order to reach the end has not understood what kind of activity they are engaged in. They have applied the logic of a journey to something that operates according to an entirely different logic. And Watts's claim is that most people, most of the time, are making exactly this mistake with their lives. The implication about quality of engagement follows from this, and it runs counter to what one might initially expect. The music model does not counsel inattention or passivity. The musician who is fully absorbed in the playing is not less attentive. The dancer who is fully present in the dance is not less responsive to their partner. They are more responsive. Every nuance of the music is available to them precisely because they are not mentally somewhere else, calculating the distance to the final bar. Their attention is free to receive what is actually happening in the present moment of the playing. This is what Watts meant when he described the real secret of life as being completely engaged with what you are doing in the here and now. And instead of calling it work, realizing it is play. The philosophy of play is not about doing less. It is not about abandoning seriousness or effort. It is about doing everything with a fundamentally different quality of engagement, one in which attention has been freed from the ego's persistent agenda of self-advancement and can therefore respond fully to what is present. The ego, as earlier modules established, is always elsewhere, in the remembered past or the anticipated future. The musician who is genuinely playing is nowhere but here. This brings the music image into direct contact with two threads running through the earlier parts of this series. The distinction Alan Watts draws between work and play is one of the most carefully constructed and philosophically consequential arguments in his entire body of thought. It is not, as one might initially assume, a distinction between effort and ease, or between serious and frivolous activities. Watts is precise about this. Work, in his philosophical sense, is any activity that derives its value entirely from its result. It is instrumental activity, a means to an end, and its worth is wholly dependent on the achievement of that end. If the goal is not reached, the activity was wasted. Play, by contrast, is activity valued for itself. It is its own end, and its worth does not depend on any outcome beyond the activity itself. A child building a sandcastle is not building it to have a sandcastle. The building is the point. This distinction cuts cleanly across the conventional categories. The same activity can be work or play, depending entirely on the quality of engagement brought to it. A musician practicing scales for an audition is working. A musician playing the same scales for the sheer pleasure of the sound is playing. The scales are identical. The relationship to them is not. What Watts identified in modern Western culture was a systematic and almost total colonization of play by the logic of work. Even those domains of life nominally set aside from productive labor have been absorbed into the instrumental framework. Exercise is pursued for health outcomes. Holidays are justified by their restorative effect on productivity. Relationships are managed for social capital. Hobbies are curated for self-improvement and the cultivation of marketable skills. The pure, purposeless absorption in an activity for its own sake, the kind of unself-conscious engagement that is natural to children, has become almost impossible for modern adults to sustain without guilt. There is always the nagging sense that time spent without measurable outcome is time wasted. Watts captured this with characteristic precision in his lecture series, observing that Western culture had confused the symbol with the reality, the means with the end, arriving at the position of a person who has eaten the menu instead of the meal. This is not merely a colorful metaphor. It connects directly to the map territory confusion that runs through his entire philosophical project. The colonization of play by work is the temporal expression of that same fundamental error, mistaking the representation of life for life itself, pursuing the symbols of fulfillment, whilst the actual experience of living passes unnoticed. Watts's constructive response to this diagnosis was not a call to abandon goals or to stop working. That would be a misreading of his position, and he was careful to resist it. His proposal was subtler and more demanding, to bring the spirit of play to everything, including work. The craftsman who genuinely loves their craft is playing, even when the work is difficult and the hours are long. The scientist moved by authentic curiosity about the world is playing, even when the research is painstaking. The teacher genuinely interested in their students is playing, even when the preparation is exhausting. In each case, the activity has become its own reward, and the result is both more effective and more alive than its purely instrumental counterpart. Watts connected this directly to the Taoist concept of Wu Wei, the action that arises from genuine engagement with the present rather than from the ego's agenda of self-advancement. The person acting from Wu Wei is not straining toward a goal. They are fully present to what the moment requires, and the action flows naturally from that presence. This is where Watts identifies a genuine paradox, one that Western culture's obsession with purposiveness has almost entirely obscured. The person who works in the spirit of play frequently achieves more than the person who works in the spirit of grim determination. The reason is not mysterious. The grimly purposive worker is dividing their energy between the activity and the constant monitoring of their performance, the management of anxiety about outcomes, the suppression of fear about failure. The playful worker is simply doing the thing. As Watts put it in his lecture series, The person fully absorbed in what they are doing has no time to be anxious about whether they are doing it well. This is the backwards law made visible in practice. The universe is not a battlefield. That single recognition, properly understood, changes everything about how one inhabits existence. In an earlier part of this series, we encountered the idea that the verbal mind habitually misclassifies opposites as independent entities, treating light and darkness, self and world, as though they were separate forces in competition rather than poles of a single continuum. That was an epistemological correction, a repair to the way thinking carves up experience. But Watts does not stop there. In The Two Hands of God, and throughout his lecture series on the Tao of Philosophy, he takes that recognition as already established and presses toward a deeper question. If opposites are genuinely poles of a single continuum, what does this reveal about the structure of reality itself? The answer he arrives at is not merely that we think about opposites incorrectly. It is that the universe is constituted by their dance. The yin-yang symbol is Watts's central image here, and he is careful to distinguish how he reads it from how it is commonly misread. The symbol does not represent a truce between good and evil, nor a static equilibrium between positive and negative forces. It represents something far more dynamic and far more strange. Each half of the symbol contains within it a seed of its opposite, a small circle of the contrary color nested at the fullest point of each arc. This is not decorative. It is the entire philosophical point. At the moment light reaches its maximum, darkness begins to grow within it. At the moment darkness is most complete, light is already germinating. The movement is not oscillation between two fixed states, but a continuous, rhythmic arising of each pole from within the other. Watts calls this a cosmological image rather than merely a cognitive corrective. It describes the structure of reality itself, the way the universe generates and sustains itself through the interplay of complementary forces. As he writes in The Two Hands of God, the universe is not a battlefield between good and evil, but a dance between complementary forces. That word, dance. The practical implication of this cosmological claim goes considerably further than the epistemological point alone could take us. If pleasure and pain are genuinely poles of a single continuum, if the capacity for joy is not merely accompanied by the capacity for suffering but is inseparable from it, then the project of eliminating suffering whilst retaining joy is not merely difficult. It is incoherent. It is the attempt to have one end of a stick without the other end. Watts develops this with particular force in The Wisdom of Insecurity, where he observes that the more you try to avoid suffering, the more you suffer, because smaller and more insignificant things begin to torture you in proportion to your fear of being hurt. The logic here is precise. The person who has contracted around the avoidance of pain has not made themselves safe. They have made themselves exquisitely sensitive to every minor disturbance, because every minor disturbance now carries the threat of the suffering they are fleeing. The armor becomes the wound. What Watts proposes in place of this is not resignation and not indifference. It is a fundamentally different relationship to difficulty, one of participation rather than resistance. The person who has genuinely absorbed the polarity of existence does not fight the difficult pole of experience in the hope of abolishing it. They dance with it. This is where Taoist Wu Wei, the principle of acting in harmony with the grain of things rather than against it, converges with the Vedantic notion of Leela, the universe as divine play, and with the Zen recognition of the double bind that arises whenever consciousness tries to step outside the present moment and manage it from a position of safety. All three traditions are pointing at the same structure, The attempt to control the dance from outside the dance is itself the source of the suffering one is trying to escape. The only coherent response is to enter the dance fully. And this is the culmination of the philosophy of play that has been building across this entire module. Watts returns again and again in his lectures to the image of music. Music does not travel toward a destination. A symphony is not a vehicle for arriving at its final chord. Part 11. The Art of Living. Everything explored in this video, the illusion of the separate self, the universe as a single, unified field, the liberation from time anxiety, the philosophy of play and spontaneity, amounts to nothing if it remains merely a set of beliefs. Watts was absolutely clear on this point, and it is perhaps the most important thing he ever said. The question is not whether you believe that the ego is a fiction. The question is whether you can actually see the world without the filter of the skin-encapsulated ego operating. These are entirely different questions, and the second is immeasurably harder than the first. Beliefs are cheap. Perception is everything. Throughout his lecture series and in the book, Watts returned to this distinction again and again, insisting that his philosophy was not a doctrine to be accepted or rejected, but an invitation to look, to attend to one's own experience with complete honesty and complete openness. He put it plainly, the purpose of this philosophy is not to give you something to believe, but to give you something to see. That distinction cuts through a great deal of confusion about what Watts was actually offering. He was not asking for intellectual agreement. He was pointing toward a transformation of attention, a change in the quality of perception itself. And that quality of attention has a specific character that Watts described with care, drawing on Krishnamurti's formulation, which he engaged with throughout his career. Watts pointed toward what he called choiceless awareness, a mode of perception in which one is fully present to whatever is happening, without the constant editorial commentary of the verbal mind running alongside it. The verbal mind is always categorizing, judging, comparing, anticipating. It translates raw experience into concepts before the experience has even fully registered. Choiceless awareness is the capacity to receive experience before that translation occurs. It is the quality of attention a child brings to something genuinely new, or that a painter brings to their subject, completely open, completely receptive, not yet organized by expectation and prior category. In The Wisdom of Insecurity, Watts described it as the art of being fully present, not to a particular kind of experience, but to whatever experience is actually happening. The crucial phrase is whatever experience is actually happening. This is not a selective presence reserved for pleasant or elevated moments. It is a quality of attention available in any moment, including the difficult ones. Watts was deeply suspicious of the spiritual ambition that often surrounds this kind of territory, and his suspicion was philosophically precise. The desire for permanent enlightenment, for a final, stable state of awakening that would resolve all uncertainty and eliminate all difficulty, is itself a product of the very ego it claims to transcend. It is the backwards law applied to spiritual seeking. The ego, unable to tolerate its own groundlessness, reaches for the ultimate security, a state in which it will never again feel uncertain, never again feel lost, never again be carried away by fear or confusion. That ambition is the ego in its most sophisticated disguise. Watts was explicit about this in his lectures. The point is not to achieve a permanent state of enlightenment, but to notice, with increasing frequency and clarity, when you are not present, and to return. That formulation is both more honest and more genuinely liberating than the conventional spiritual ambition. It asks nothing heroic. It asks only for a quality of noticing and a willingness to return, again and again. Each time the verbal mind has carried one away into its commentary. The return itself is the practice. There is no final arrival. What Watts offered instead of techniques were invitations, and the distinction matters. A technique is a means to an end, something applied in order to produce a desired result. An invitation is a gesture towards something already present. The practice of genuine listening, attending to sound without immediately translating it into meaning, is not a method for achieving a goal. It is a way of inhabiting the present moment more fully, right now, in this sound, before the mind has finished labeling it. The practice of looking, attending to visual experience without immediately categorizing what one sees, is the same gesture. The skin-encapsulated ego does not merely misunderstand the world, it misunderstands everyone in it. By its very structure, the ego relates to others instrumentally. Other people become, in the economy of the separate self, sources of approval, pleasure, security, and validation. They are resources to be managed, mirrors to be angled correctly, threats to be neutralized, or allies to be cultivated. Watts was characteristically honest about this, and characteristically unsentimental. He was not describing bad people or broken people. He was describing the ordinary condition of ego-driven consciousness, the baseline mode of human relating that most people never question, because they have never seen it from the outside. His formulation is memorable precisely because it refuses comfort. The ego does not love, it uses. What we call love is usually a mutual agreement to exploit each other. This is not cynicism. It is diagnosis. The ego loves you because you make it feel good, and it will continue to love you for exactly as long as you continue to do so. The moment you fail to supply the required validation, the warmth cools. The relationship, which appeared to be about you, was always about the ego's own maintenance. What Watts is pointing toward is not a flaw in certain relationships, but a structural feature of ego consciousness itself. The ego cannot genuinely see another person because it is always looking through the lens of its own needs and fears. The other person becomes a projection, a screen onto which the ego casts its own desires and anxieties. This is why so much of what passes for love is actually a sophisticated form of control. We want the people we love to be a certain way, to behave in certain ways, to confirm certain things about us. And when they fail to do so, we experience it as a betrayal. But they have not betrayed us. They have simply been themselves, which was never quite what we wanted. Genuine love, in Watts's understanding, is not a feeling directed at another person. It is a quality of attention brought to another person. It is the capacity to see them as they actually are, rather than as a projection of one's own interior landscape. His formulation in his lecture series is precise. Love is not an emotion. It is a way of seeing. This connects directly to the transformation of attention that emerges when the ego's grip begins to loosen. The same quality of choiceless awareness that allows one to see the world freshly, without the constant narration of the anxious self, also allows one to see another person freshly. Without the distorting pressure of needing them to be something in particular, they become visible. Their actual texture, their actual presence, their actual being. This is why Watts's treatment of love cannot be separated from his broader philosophy of attention. The person who has begun to see through the illusion of the separate self does not merely think differently about relationships. They inhabit relationships differently. The quality of their presence changes. They are no longer primarily occupied with managing the impression they are making or calculating what they are receiving. They are simply there, attending, and that quality of genuine attention is itself the most intimate thing one person can offer another. The Taoist principle of Wu Wei enters here with particular force. The most loving thing one can do for another person is often to stop trying to change them, to stop maneuvering them toward conformity with one's expectations, to be present with them as they actually are, in this moment, without an agenda. Watts was clear that this is not passivity. It is a form of respect deeper than any active intervention, because it honors the other person's own nature rather than subordinating it to one's preferences. He put it simply in his lecture series: the greatest gift you can give another person is your complete attention. Not advice, not improvement, not the project of their betterment. Attention. And if you are constituted by your relationships, as the ecological vision of the self established earlier in this series insists, then the quality of your attention in those relationships is not merely a personal matter. It is a dimension of your own being. To be inattentive to others is to be inattentive to what you are. There is a further dimension to this that Watts develops with care. There is a persistent temptation, when engaging with a philosophy as expansive as Watts's, to imagine its endpoint as a kind of arrival, a state of permanent serenity, a condition beyond confusion, beyond grief, beyond the ordinary friction of being human. Watts refused this image entirely. The fully alive person he described throughout his lectures and in the book is not a perfected sage hovering above the difficulties of existence. They are not someone who has solved the problem of being human. They are someone who has a different relationship to their problems, one of engagement rather than avoidance, of curiosity rather than anxiety. This distinction matters enormously. The idealized, enlightened figure of popular imagination is essentially a person who has escaped the human condition. Watts found this vision not only philosophically confused but aesthetically impoverished. A person who cannot be genuinely sad when sadness is appropriate, who cannot be genuinely troubled by genuine trouble, has not transcended the human condition. They have simply gone numb to it. The fully alive person, by contrast, is more fully present to their experience, not less. Their sorrow is real sorrow. Their joy is real joy. What has changed is not the content of their experience, but the ground from which they meet it. That ground is what Watts described as integration. Not the resolution of all contradictions, but the capacity to hold contradictions without being torn apart by them. The fully alive person can be simultaneously serious and playful, fully committed to their particular life and quietly aware of its place within a vastly larger process. They can be genuinely attached to the people and things they love without experiencing those attachments as threats to their fundamental being. Watts put it precisely: the fully alive person has nothing to lose, not because they have no attachments, but because they no longer experience their attachments as threats to who they are at the deepest level. This connects directly to the wisdom of insecurity, explored earlier in this series. The acceptance of fundamental insecurity is not a resignation to loss. It is not a practiced indifference designed to protect against pain. It is something more radical: the recognition that the self which fears loss is itself a construction, a story told about experience rather than the experiencing itself. When that recognition deepens, the ground of one's being is no longer something that can be taken away, because it was never a possession in the first place. Freedom, in Watts's understanding, is not freedom from difficulty. It is freedom within difficulty, which is an entirely different thing. The art of living, as Watts conceived it. It is not a set of techniques. It is not a discipline to be practiced or a system to be followed. It is a quality of engagement with existence that is simultaneously fully committed and fundamentally relaxed. He returned repeatedly to the image of the artist absorbed in their work. The painter who is fully present to what they are painting is not trying to produce a masterpiece. They are simply doing what the work requires, moment by moment, with complete attention and without self-consciousness. The masterpiece, if it comes at all, comes as a consequence of that quality of attention, not as its goal. The art of living is the application of this same quality to the whole of one's existence. Watts described it as the art of being completely what you are, not what you think you should be, not what others expect you to be, but what you actually are in this moment, without apology or self-consciousness. This is not permission for complacency. It is something far more demanding. To be completely what you are requires the dissolution of the constant internal commentary that edits, judges, and narrates experience before it can be fully felt. Most people, Watts observed, do not live their lives so much as manage them, maintaining a careful distance from their own experience through the mediating layer of self-consciousness. Here is where Watts's final practical word carries its characteristic paradox. You cannot try to be fully alive in the way he describes. The trying is itself the obstacle. The moment you set out to achieve presence, you have introduced the very self-consciousness that prevents it. Part 12. The Coherence of the Vision. Alan Watts, across 4 decades of writing and lecturing, never really changed his subject. The books shift in emphasis, the traditions change, the vocabulary transforms from Christian mysticism to Zen, to Vedanta, to Taoism, to cybernetics. But the question underneath remains constant. In the book, Watts states it plainly. The whole of his work is an attempt to answer a single question. Who, or what, are you really? Every lecture, every volume, every broadcast is a different approach to that same fundamental interrogation. The wisdom of insecurity diagnoses the anxiety produced by a self trying to secure itself against the flow of time. The way of Zen explores the particular technique of a tradition that short-circuits the verbal mind's compulsive self-narration. The joyous cosmology investigates the dissolution of the boundary between self and world through direct experience. The Watercourse Way traces the Taoist vision of a universe that moves without forcing. The book itself delivers the cosmological argument in its most direct form. You are not a separate entity inhabiting the universe. You are something the universe is doing. The problem Watts is always addressing is the experience of being a skin-encapsulated ego, isolated, anxious, perpetually striving, perpetually at war with the very ground of its own existence. What makes Watts's project philosophically serious, rather than merely eclectic, is the recognition that this problem cannot be solved from a single angle. The skin-encapsulated ego is not a simple intellectual error that evaporates once the correct argument is presented. It is a condition, simultaneously embedded in how we think, how we feel, how we understand ourselves metaphysically, how we relate to time, how we conceive of the divine, and how we understand the natural world. At the level of thought, the verbal mind mistakes its own maps for the territory, generating the illusion of a fixed self from the grammar of subject and predicate. At the level of feeling, there is the chronic background anxiety Watts identifies in The Wisdom of Insecurity, the unease of a creature that cannot stop trying to grasp its own existence. Metaphysically, the Cartesian inheritance positions the self as a subject, sealed off from an objective world it merely observes. In relation to time, the self enacts what Watts calls the great postponement, perpetually deferring genuine living to a future that never arrives. Theologically, it projects its own separateness onto the cosmos and invents a cosmic boss who mirrors its own anxious need for control. A problem embedded simultaneously at all these levels requires responses at every level simultaneously. That is not eclecticism. That is philosophical precision. The modules of this video are not merely thematically related, they are structurally interdependent in ways that become visible only when the whole is assembled. The Zen insight into the double bind, the impossibility of forcing spontaneity, is deepened by the Taoist concept of Wu Wei, which provides not just a diagnosis but a lived orientation, the way of acting that is not forcing, the intelligence that flows like water. The Vedantic cosmology of Lila, the universe as divine play, enriches the ecological vision of the universe as organism, because Lila explains not merely what the universe is but why it plays. The whole point is the game itself, not any outcome beyond it. The philosophy of time, which liberates attention from the anxious future, feeds directly into the philosophy of play, because play is precisely what becomes possible when the great postponement is abandoned. And the identity of nirvana and samsara, the Zen insistence that liberation is not elsewhere, completes the anti-escapist reading that runs through every tradition Watts examines. As he put it in his lecture series, these traditions are not saying different things. They are saying the same thing in different languages. The whole is genuinely greater than the sum of its parts, because each element illuminates the others in ways that none could achieve in isolation. The coherence that emerges from this is the coherence of a genuine philosophical system. Watts's work is not a collection of interesting ideas loosely associated under the banner of Eastern wisdom. Watts's philosophy presents itself, throughout his entire body of work, as descriptive rather than prescriptive. He is not telling you how the world ought to be. He is telling you how it actually is. The universe is a unified field. The self is a process, not a fixed entity. The ego's sense of separateness is a learned convention, not a metaphysical fact. These are claims about the nature of reality, and Watts consistently frames them as such. Yet the normative implications are impossible to ignore. If existence is Leela, the divine play of a universe that is fundamentally self-delighting, does that counsel indifference to suffering? If the self is ultimately illusory, does ethics lose its foundation? These questions were raised during Watts's lifetime by academic philosophers who found his metaphysical claims too sweeping, by political activists who found his emphasis on inner transformation dangerously quietist, and by serious practitioners within the Zen and Vedantic traditions who found his demystification of enlightenment insufficiently rigorous. The tensions are real, and they deserve honest treatment. The ethical objection is the most philosophically serious. If the boundary between self and other is a convenient fiction, what motivates care for others? The conventional answer assumes that ethics requires a robust self, a subject who chooses to act well toward distinct others. Dissolve the self, and the argument appears to dissolve with it. Watts's response, developed most carefully in psychotherapy East and West, is that this objection misunderstands what the dissolution of ego actually produces. He writes that the person who has genuinely seen through the illusion of separateness does not become indifferent to suffering. They become more sensitive to it, because they no longer have the ego's defenses against it. This is not a rhetorical flourish. It is a philosophically substantive claim. The ego, in Watts's account, is partly a mechanism of insulation. It maintains the fiction of separateness precisely because full permeability to the world's suffering would be overwhelming. When that insulation dissolves, what remains is not detachment but a kind of unmediated compassion, not chosen as a moral duty but arising naturally from the direct perception that the suffering of others is not separate from oneself. Whether this fully resolves the ethical objection is debatable, but it is a serious philosophical response, not an evasion. The political objection cuts differently. Watts's emphasis on acceptance, on the present moment, on the futility of anxious striving, can appear to counsel withdrawal from the struggle to change unjust conditions. His response, articulated across several lecture series, is that the most effective political action arises from clarity rather than anxiety. He argues that the person who acts from genuine understanding of a situation, rather than from the ego's reactive rage or its need for self-justification, is more effective, not less, because they are not dissipating energy on internal conflict. The activist consumed by resentment and self-righteousness is, in Watts's account, partly acting out of the same ego-driven patterns that produce the injustice they oppose. This is a defensible position, and it has genuine philosophical precedent in Stoic thought and in the Taoist concept of Wu Wei. Yet it remains genuinely contested. The objection that inner clarity is a luxury available primarily to those not directly subject to oppression is not easily dismissed, and Watts does not fully answer it. Acknowledging this is not a concession that undermines his vision. It is an honest recognition that a philosophy of consciousness has limits as a complete political theory. Then there are the personal tensions, which Watts himself never concealed. He drank heavily throughout much of his adult life. He was married 3 times. He described himself, with characteristic wit and candor, as a genuine fake, and elsewhere as a philosophical entertainer rather than a guru. These biographical facts have been used to dismiss him, as though a philosopher who does not embody their philosophy has nothing worth hearing. But this misunderstands both Watts and the nature of philosophical insight. Watts never claimed to have achieved the permanent, luminous equanimity he described. He claimed to have seen something important about the nature of experience, and to be communicating it as honestly as he could. The problems that Alan Watts spent his life examining have not receded. They have deepened. The ecological crisis he described in the 1960s as the inevitable consequence of a civilization that sees itself as separate from and superior to the natural world has become, in the decades since, an existential emergency. The epidemic of anxiety and purposelessness that he diagnosed in the wisdom of insecurity has intensified into a full-scale crisis of mental health across the developed world. The dominance of the verbal, analytical mind over every other mode of knowing, the tyranny of the symbol over the reality it was meant to represent, has, if anything, accelerated with the rise of digital culture, where experience is increasingly mediated, catalogued, and converted into information before it has been felt. And the hard problem of consciousness, the question of how and why there is subjective experience at all, remains precisely as intractable as it was when Watts was arguing that Western science had fundamentally misconceived the relationship between mind and world. The contemporary resonances of his work are not coincidental. The explosion of interest in mindfulness and meditation across the Western world is, at its root, a response to the same pathology Watts identified: a civilization so thoroughly captured by its own abstractions that it has lost contact with the immediate, sensory, unrepeatable texture of being alive. The growing ecological consciousness, the slow recognition that the boundary between organism and environment is a fiction that nature does not observe, echoes his insistence that the skin is not a wall but a threshold. The philosophical debates about the nature of consciousness, the question of whether experience can ever be fully explained in third-person terms, circle back repeatedly to the intuition that Watts drew from Vedanta and from his own direct experience, that awareness is not a product of the universe, but its very nature. What Watts contributed to these conversations was not a set of solutions. It was a quality of questioning. In one of his lecture series, he put it plainly. He was not trying to give his listeners answers. He was trying to give them better questions. This is not a failure of philosophical ambition. It is, in a very precise sense, its highest expression. The philosopher who knows that the most fundamental questions cannot be finally settled. Questions about the nature of self, about the ground of reality, about what it means to live well, and who refuses to resolve them prematurely into the comfort of a doctrine, is doing something rarer and more valuable than the philosopher who delivers a system. Watts's synthesis of Eastern and Western thought was never intended as the final word. It was an opening, an invitation to think differently about what thinking is and what it is for. His philosophy is alive only in the degree to which it illuminates actual experience. It is not a set of propositions to be accepted or rejected from a distance. It is a lens to be held up against one's own moments of clarity and confusion, one's own encounters with beauty, suffering, love, and death. In The Wisdom of Insecurity, Watts offered what is perhaps the most honest criterion for evaluating any philosophy. The only genuine test is whether it helps you to live more fully and more honestly. Not whether it is logically consistent, not whether it can be defended against every objection, but whether it opens something in the person who seriously inhabits it. That is a demanding standard. It is also the right one, and it is the standard by which his own work must ultimately be judged. Not in the lecture hall, but in the living of a life. The wave returns to the ocean. The particular pattern that was Alan Watts. That specific, unrepeatable combination of wit, erudition, playfulness, and profound seriousness has dissolved back into the process that generated it. He would have found this entirely fitting. He spent decades arguing that the self is not a fixed entity but an event, a movement in the universal field, and his own disappearance from the field is simply that argument made good. But the questions he asked, and the quality of attention he brought to them, continue to ripple outward. In one of his lectures, he observed that the philosopher's work is not to provide answers but to keep the questions alive. The questions Watts kept alive are not historical curiosities. Par 13. There is a single thread running through everything explored in this video. Not an argument to be won, not a position to be defended, but a recognition waiting to be made. The thread is this: the experience of being a separate, isolated self, bounded by skin, stranded in time, anxious about its own survival in an indifferent universe, is real as an experience, but it is not the deepest truth about what you are. Underneath it, or more accurately as it, something vastly larger is happening. The universe is playing at being you. It is looking at itself through your eyes, thinking through your mind, feeling through your heart. This is not a metaphor offered for comfort. It is Watts's central and most radical claim, and it carries the full weight of everything he spent 40 years working out. The images that have recurred throughout this exploration are not decorative. Each one illuminates a different facet of the same recognition, and together they form something close to a complete picture. The wave and the ocean came first. You are not a thing moving through the universe, but a function of what the whole universe is doing, precisely as a wave is not a separate object traveling across water, but what the whole ocean is doing at that particular place. The menu and the meal followed. The self you take yourself to be, the one with a name and a history and a set of preferences, is a description of something, not the thing itself. Eating the menu leaves you perpetually hungry. The backwards law showed what happens when the ego tries to solve this problem by its own methods. The harder it grasps for security, the more security recedes, because the grasping is itself the source of the insecurity. The aperture image reframed the entire situation. Consciousness is not a ghost trapped in a machine, but the universe opening a window onto itself, an aperture through which the whole becomes aware of its own existence. And the invitation to play showed what life looks like when these recognitions have genuinely landed. Not a solemn spiritual achievement, but a dance, a song, a game worth playing entirely for its own sake. These images do not merely illustrate Watts's philosophy. They are its method. Watts distrusted systems precisely because the kind of truth he was pointing toward cannot be captured in a logical structure without immediately becoming something else. A doctrine, a belief, an object for the ego to acquire and display. The images work differently. They create conditions for recognition rather than arguments for acceptance. They invite the listener to notice something about their own experience rather than to adopt a new intellectual position. This distinction was not incidental to Watts's project. It was the whole of it. The taboo against knowing who you are, which Watts took as his central diagnostic concept, is real, and it runs deep. The cultural conditioning that insists on the separate self as the fundamental unit of experience is not a superficial habit easily shed. Seeing through it requires something more than intellectual agreement with a set of propositions. It requires a kind of courage, the willingness to let go of the very thing that feels most essentially like you. But the liberation that follows this recognition is not a departure from the human condition. It is its fullest expression. Watts was insistent on this. Nirvana is samsara. The liberated state is not a different world entered by leaving this one behind. It is this world, seen with clear eyes, inhabited without the burden of mistaken identity. As Watts put it across various formulations in his lecture work, the point is not to escape the world, but to stop fighting it, to inhabit it more fully, more honestly, more joyfully than the ego's anxious striving ever allows. This is what makes Watts's lasting contribution so difficult to categorize and so genuinely valuable. It is not a doctrine. It is a disposition, an orientation toward existence that is simultaneously more honest and more joyful than the ordinary Western default. More honest because it acknowledges the fundamental insecurity and impermanence of all things without flinching, without reaching for false consolations or metaphysical insurance policies. More joyful because it recognizes that insecurity and impermanence are not defects in reality, not flaws to be corrected by the right philosophy or the right spiritual practice. They are reality's most essential characteristics. They are the very conditions that make experience possible at all.